Hey guys, what made a medieval home unpleasant was not usually one single foul thing, but the uncomfortable fact that almost everything people needed to survive could also produce a smell. The fire that kept a family warm, the rushes on the floor, the animals close by, the damp in the walls, the food being stored for winter, even the people themselves all mingled together in ways that modern homes are designed very carefully to prevent. And before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from tonight and what history topic you'd like me to cover next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, giving the video a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past, subscribing is the best way to find your way back here. Now, to understand why medieval houses smelled worse than most people imagine, it helps to begin with something easy to overlook. The people living in those houses were not careless, and they were not simply used to filth in the lazy way modern stereotypes suggest. They noticed smell very keenly. They complained about it, wrote about it, prayed against corruption and decay, used herbs and smoke and fresh air where they could, and associated foul odor not only with discomfort but with danger, sickness, poverty, and moral disorder. If a house smelled bad, that meant something. The deeper story is not that medieval people did not care. It is that they lived inside material conditions that made clean, dry, neutral-smelling domestic space extraordinarily difficult to create. A medieval house, especially for ordinary people, was not arranged around comfort in the modern sense. It was arranged around survival. That one fact changes almost everything. A house had to hold heat, store food, shelter bodies, protect tools, sometimes house animals, and make room for work. It was not always sharply divided into private functions. Cooking, sleeping, spinning, repairing, child-rearing, eating, storage, and sometimes small-scale craft production could all happen within a very limited area. In many cases, the same enclosed space that gave a family safety from cold rain and theft also trapped smoke, moisture, stale breath, grease, and human waste from chamber pots waiting to be emptied. Even before stepping inside, the smell of the home often began just outside it. Medieval towns were dense with animals, mud, offal, tanning, brewing, dung, and drains that worked imperfectly at best. In the countryside, the smells were different, but not necessarily gentler. There might be wet earth, manure heaps, pigs, poultry, damp straw, and middens lying near the dwelling because useful waste and foul waste were not always easy to separate. People lived close to the cycle of consumption and decay. Scraps attracted animals. Animals produced dung. Dung could be useful. Rotting matter could not simply be sealed away in plastic bins and taken elsewhere by municipal service. It remained near human life because nearly everything remained near human life. And then there was the building itself. Many medieval homes were made from timber, plaster, daub, thatch, and earth-based materials that absorbed moisture readily. In dry weather, these materials could feel sturdy and familiar. In wet weather, they could take on a persistent scent of dampness that modern people would immediately recognize from basements, barns, or old sheds. Except in a medieval house, that damp did not remain politely in one corner. It soaked into walls, clung to rush matting, settled into clothing, and rose again when the fire warmed the room. A cold, wet season did not just make a house uncomfortable. It could make the whole interior smell alive with mildew, smoke, and stale organic matter. The floor is one of those details that sounds almost quaint until you stop and think about it for a moment. Many listeners have heard that medieval floors were strewn with rushes or reeds, and the image can seem charming from a distance, almost rustic. But the practical reality could be much less romantic. Fresh rushes might briefly sweeten a room and provide insulation underfoot. Old rushes, especially if not changed frequently, became a trap. They caught spilled ale, broth, grease, crumbs, ash, tracked mud, animal droppings, and everything carried in on boots and hems. In a busy household, that mixture was pressed down, walked over, dampened, dried, and dampened again. What began as a layer of comfort could slowly become a sponge for the entire odor of the house. This is one of the first important reversals in the story. Some of the very things that made a medieval house more livable in the short term could make it smell worse over time. Straw gave warmth, but held damp. Curtains reduced drafts, but trapped stale air. Heavy chests protected goods, but closed up fabrics that might already be musty. A central hearth provided heat, hot food, and a place to gather, but unless smoke escaped efficiently, it coated rafters and textiles with soot and an oily burnt smell that never entirely left. Improvement and discomfort often arrived together. The hearth sat at the center of domestic life for a reason, and yet it was also one of the greatest contributors to the atmosphere of the home. In earlier and poorer dwellings, smoke escaped through the roof as best it could, or through openings not designed with modern precision. Even in houses with chimneys, ventilation was often imperfect. The result was an indoor climate that could sting the eyes, dry the throat, and leave a lingering smoky smell in hair, wool, bedding, and stored food. To us, the smell of wood smoke can seem cozy when encountered briefly on a winter evening. But endless smoke is not a scented candle. It is residue. It sits inside fabric. It mixes with animal fat, damp leather, and unwashed skin. It becomes part of the permanent signature of the house. Cooking intensified this further. Medieval kitchens, whether separate or integrated into the main living space, were places of boiling broth, roasting meat when available, frying in fat, baking coarse bread, brewing, fermenting, and storing ingredients that were not always fresh in a modern sense. Salted fish, onions, garlic, cabbage, old cheese, sour ale, and preserved meat all had forceful odors of their own. They were ordinary foods, perfectly sensible foods, but they did not disappear into sealed refrigerators after use. Their smells lingered in open baskets, hanging bundles, barrels, and cloth sacks. A room where food was cooked was also often a room where food was kept, and sometimes where people slept. The boundary between kitchen scent and body scent and building scent was thin. Storage is another place where modern assumptions can mislead us. We tend to imagine storage as a clean pause, an orderly waiting. In the medieval world, storage was a constant struggle against insects, damp, spoilage, rodents, mold, and hunger. Grain could sour, meat could go bad, butter turned, beer soured, fruit dried unevenly. Smokehouses and salting were useful, but they did not create odorless abundance. They created edible durability, often with a strong smell attached. A house in late winter might carry the tired scent of provisions that had been enduring for months. Not always rotten, not always dangerous, but old. There is a very particular smell to food being kept just on the safe side of decay, and medieval people knew it intimately. Clothing did not offer much escape. Laundry was labor-intensive, water had to be carried, fuel had to be used to heat it when needed, and soap was not a casual convenience. Linen undergarments could be washed more often than outer woolens, but outer garments, blankets, cloaks, and mattresses absorbed smoke and body oils for long periods. Wool itself can hold a lanolin scent. Leather can smell rich at first and rank later, especially when damp. Footwear carried in mud, manure, and street waste from outside. Bed coverings held sweat, sickness, and the breath of several sleepers in a single curtained space. And since many people owned relatively few garments, what they wore each day was often what they worked in, cooked in, and slept near. This matters because the medieval house was not only a shelter from the world outside. It was also a container for the human body in all its ordinary realities. Childbirth, fever, old age, dirty hands from fieldwork, wet cloaks after rain, feet that had spent the day in mud. and the simple fact of many bodies sharing limited air all contributed to the domestic smellscape. People did wash more often than popular myth sometimes claims, but regular full-body bathing was constrained by labor, privacy, temperature, fuel, and access. Cleanliness was real, but it was negotiated. No one stepped into a modern bathroom, turned a tap, and erased the day in 10 minutes. And perhaps the most uncomfortable point, though also one of the most revealing, is that medieval houses often sat very close to animals for practical reasons. Not every family slept beside livestock, and the old caricature can be overstated, but in many households animals were near enough to shape the atmosphere of domestic life. Chickens in the yard, pigs nearby, horses in adjacent structures, cows close at hand, dogs underfoot, cats in storerooms hunting vermin. All of them useful, all of them producing smells. In colder regions and harder seasons, the warmth of animals could be valuable. So could their protection from theft. What sounds strange to modern ears often made practical sense. Yet practical sense had a smell. And once you begin to see the medieval house this way, not as a romantic cottage but as a dense survival machine, the odors become easier to understand. They were not random signs of backwardness. They were the byproduct of compression. Too many necessary functions, too little separation, too much moisture, too much smoke, and too little effortless disposal. A good house might still smell bad by modern standards. A poor house could become overwhelming. That distinction matters because wealth changed the quality of smell more than it removed it entirely. Richer households could afford larger rooms, more storage, better airflow, separate kitchens, more frequent replacement of textiles, herbs for strewing, imported scents, and servants to carry away waste more regularly. But even there, perfumes and sweet herbs often existed alongside stale drains, rush-covered floors, and heavy tapestries that trapped years of smoke. Luxury did not mean neutrality. It often meant layering pleasant smells over unpleasant ones. A noble chamber might smell of rosemary, wax, wool, damp stone, and human occupation all at once. And that opens the next part of the story, because if medieval houses were difficult to keep fresh, medieval ideas about health, corruption, air, and cleanliness shaped how people tried to fight back against those smells, and why some remedies soothed the room while others merely disguised what could never quite be removed. Those efforts to sweeten the air were not trivial gestures. They belonged to a wider medieval understanding of what bad smells meant. To many people, foul air was not just unpleasant. It was suspicious. It seemed to signal corruption in the most literal sense. Matter breaking down, water stagnating, flesh spoiling, drains clogging, breath turning sour in enclosed rooms. Long before germ theory, people still recognized patterns. Certain places smelled bad, and certain places also seemed to make people weak, feverish, or nauseated. So when householders burned juniper, scattered mint, hung bundles of lavender where they could get it, or opened shutters to invite moving air into a stale room, they were not merely trying to create a pleasant domestic atmosphere. They were acting on a practical and moral instinct that air itself mattered. That instinct helps explain why medieval writing so often links smell, health, and order. A well-kept house was not imagined as perfectly sterile because such a thing was impossible, but it was meant to be governed. Fire should burn where it should. Waste should go where it should. Food should be stored carefully. Straw should be changed when means allowed. Beds should be aired. Drains, ditches, and privies should be kept from becoming intolerable. In other words, the medieval home was part of a larger struggle against unmanaged decay. The difficulty, of course, was that decay was always close. Wood rotted, meat spoiled, milk turned, thatch held damp, and every season brought its own smell. Summer heat ripened refuse quickly. Autumn rains thickened the ground outside. Winter closed people indoors with smoke and bodies and stored provisions. Spring loosened what had frozen. The house never escaped the natural world. It merely tried to negotiate with it. And some negotiations were more successful than others. One of the clearest divisions was between houses that could separate functions and those that could not. Once a household had enough space to move the cooking area away from sleeping spaces, or enough money to build more substantial chimneys, or enough servants and labor to empty waste promptly and replace old floor coverings, the sensory experience changed. Not into modern freshness, but into something more controlled. A merchant's house in a prosperous town might still be smoky and damp in bad weather, but it would not necessarily have the same concentrated odor as a one-room peasant dwelling in which wet boots, sleeping children, boiling cabbage, spilled ale, and a chamber pot all existed within a few paces of each other. That difference reminds us that medieval house is really a broad category that can mislead if treated too simply. A manor hall, a town tenement, a village cottage, a craftsman's house over a workshop, and a monastic lodging all had distinct smell profiles because they had distinct purposes, materials, and rhythms of life. Even within a single town, the home of a butcher and the home of a scribe would not carry the same atmosphere. Occupation mattered. If hides were being worked nearby, or fish sold, or malt dried, or cloth fulled, the smell of labor entered domestic space in ways that modern zoning laws now tend to prevent. Medieval people did not travel from a purely residential suburb into a separate industrial district and then return to a sanitized domestic refuge. More often, work and home bled into one another. The house smelled of what the household did. A brewer's dwelling, for instance, might be filled with the warm, yeasty, sour-sweet scent of fermentation, damp barrels, wet grain, smoke, and stale spilled ale. A baker's house could smell of flour dust, hot ovens, ash, sweat, and the sharp edge of dough turning if things went wrong. A tanner's district was notorious even to contemporaries, and families living near such work had little hope of excluding its forceful mix of urine, rotting tissue, and chemical treatment from the world of daily life. Even less noxious trades brought home their own residue. Smithing meant soot, hot metal, singed leather. Textile work meant wet wool, oils, dyestuffs, and sometimes mold. Domestic smell was therefore inseparable from economic life. What a house smelled like often revealed how a family survived. There is a quieter irony here too. Many modern people imagine bad smell as a sign of neglect, but in the medieval context, some strong odors were signs that essential work was actively being done. Brewing, salting, smoking, rendering fat, storing cheese, steeping fibers, drying herbs, fermenting, curing, and boiling linen were all productive processes. They did not smell neutral because life itself was not neutral. A house without any smell at all would have been not only rare, but odd, perhaps even suspiciously empty. The true problem was not the existence of smell. It was concentration, stagnation, and mixture. It was one thing for a room to smell of fresh bread, wood smoke, or drying herbs. It was another for smoke, grease, stale rushes, sweat, wet wool, chamber waste, and mildew to settle into one another until the air seemed to thicken. This is where ventilation becomes such an important and often overlooked part of the story. Medieval builders understood the value of moving air, but they also feared drafts, cold, and heat loss. An open house was easier to air, yet harder to heat. A tightly enclosed room offered protection in winter, but trapped odor. In a climate where fuel was precious and surviving the cold mattered more than indoor freshness, many decisions that seem unpleasant to us become easier to understand. It made sense to keep shutters closed against weather. It made sense to hang textiles that block drafts. It made sense to let the fire smolder for long periods. Yet each of those sensible choices had consequences. A room that preserved warmth also preserved yesterday's smoke. A bed enclosed by curtains retained heat, but also breath and body odor. A chest protected cloth from damp only until damp had already entered the cloth and then remained shut in with it. The bed itself deserves more attention than it usually receives. For modern viewers, the bed is almost a symbol of cleanliness and retreat, but in the medieval house it was one of the great reservoirs of scent. Mattresses might be stuffed with straw, feathers, flock, or whatever the household could afford, and all of these materials absorbed moisture over time. Bed linens could be aired and washed, but not constantly. Multiple people might share a bed, whether from affection, family necessity, cold, lack of furniture, or social custom. Illness happened there, childbirth happened there, children crept in during cold nights, and insects were an ever-present possibility. In wealthier houses, the bed could be an impressive object draped in valuable fabric, yet those very hangings also trapped heat, dust, and stale air. In poorer houses, bedding was simpler, but no less vulnerable to dampness, smoke, and repeated use. The place that offered rest could also smell of long occupation. And this brings us gently toward another misconception: the idea that medieval people were simply indifferent to bodily smell because everyone smelled equally bad. In reality, smell carried social meaning. Rank had a scent. So did labor. So did illness. The wealthy could afford finer linen, more changes of clothing, bathing opportunities, scented preparations, and domestic servants who reduced the physical burden of washing and airing household goods. Clergy, nobles, merchants, laborers, and the very poor did not encounter smell in identical ways. Nor did men and women whose domestic tasks and social expectations differed. A woman responsible for linen, infants, cooking, and household management likely experienced domestic odor not as a vague background but as a daily problem to be managed, interpreted, and endured. She would know when the milk was turning, when the rushes needed replacing, when the bedding had taken on too much damp, when a child's sickness changed the air of the room, when the privy needed urgent attention, and when the house felt close and foul after days of rain. That domestic knowledge, often quiet and uncelebrated in formal records, was one of the great sensory intelligences of the medieval world. People learned to read a house by smell. They could tell when ale had soured beyond use, when stored grain was in danger, when meat was becoming suspect, when a blocked drain was beginning to assert itself, when smoke was lingering more than usual because weather conditions had shifted, or when an animal shelter too near the dwelling was beginning to create trouble. A modern person entering such a house might notice only a general oppressive odor. Its inhabitants would perceive layers, warnings, and familiar patterns, not because they enjoyed them, but because survival required interpretation. Still, even interpretation had limits, and those limits become clearer when we think about waste. Few parts of medieval domestic life have acquired more myth than sanitation, partly because the realities are so vivid. Yet here too the truth is more structured than the caricature. People did not simply throw everything anywhere at random. Town authorities often tried, with varying success, to regulate dumping, street filth, butchery waste, and latrine placement. Households used privies, cesspits, drains, ditches, and chamber pots. The problem was not a complete absence of systems. The problem was that systems frequently overflowed, leaked, clogged, filled too quickly, or depended on labor that was unpleasant, irregular, and expensive. Human waste had to go somewhere, and where it went was often uncomfortably near. The privy, in theory, created distance between the body and the home's living space. In practice, that distance was often modest. A latrine might project over a pit, a moat, a drain, or a running channel if a household was fortunate enough to have one. In towns, the management of such spaces could become a constant issue. In the countryside, a simpler arrangement might suffice, but it did not produce a clean or odorless outcome. Chamber pots posed another challenge. At night or in bad weather, they were practical necessities. But a vessel filled in darkness and emptied in the morning still spent hours inside the house or just outside the door. The smell of this alone, particularly in a crowded dwelling, would have been enough to shape the entire atmosphere. And then there were children, old age, sickness, and the bodily emergencies that no household, in any era, can fully organize away. A modern home is supplied with piped water, washable surfaces, disinfectants, plumbing, sealed bins, laundry machines, and often multiple rooms that can isolate unpleasant realities. The medieval home had rags, basins, ash, soap when available, labor, patience, and improvisation. It is difficult to overstate how much of what we call cleanliness today depends not on virtue but on infrastructure. Once that is understood, medieval domestic smell stops looking like a moral failure and starts looking like the predictable result of living without hidden systems to whisk moisture, smoke, and waste out of sight. Water itself, so closely associated with washing, did not always solve the problem. Clean water had to be fetched, carried, stored, and protected from contamination. Wastewater had to be discarded somewhere. Wells could go bad. Urban water sources could be compromised by nearby industry, drainage, or careless disposal. In some places, hauling enough water for extensive cleaning was a considerable task. A floor could be swept more easily than scrubbed. Linen could be aired more easily than washed. Hands could be rinsed when a full body wash was unrealistic. Even where bathhouses existed, and in some places they certainly did, using them depended on cost, custom, morality, gender norms, and local conditions. Medieval people were not strangers to washing. They were strangers to effortless washing. The same was true of scenting. Herbs, flowers, rushes, incense, resin, perfumes, and aromatic woods all appear in the record, but they must be imagined in proper proportion. A handful of sweet herbs spread over a floor could brighten a room for a time, especially when newly cut. A pomander or scented cloth might help a person moving through foul urban air. Smoke from certain woods or plants could change the atmosphere of a chamber. Yet these were interventions, not permanent victories. They sat on top of deeper realities. Porous walls stored food, bodies at rest and at work. Wet weather, livestock, soot, refuse, and the slow biological persistence of the pre-modern household. In fact, some of the most fragrant materials used to improve domestic air reveal just how conscious people were of the problem. Rosemary, sage, mint, lavender, meadowsweet, and other plants were valued not only because they smelled pleasant, but because they seemed to refresh and purify enclosed spaces. Floors were strewn, rooms fumigated, linens perfumed, and in elite settings imported aromatics might be burned or worn. The point was not luxury alone. It was correction. Such practices make little sense if everyone was cheerfully indifferent to stench. They make perfect sense if people were trying, within the limits of their world, to hold back an ever-returning tide of sourness, damp, and rot. The more one looks at it, the more medieval domestic smell becomes a story about thresholds. Thresholds between indoors and outdoors, between useful and spoiled, between warmth and suffocation, between human and animal space, between respectable order and creeping decay. A house had to sit on those thresholds every day. And because it did, smell could change quickly. A room might be tolerable in the morning, oppressive by evening, fresher in dry weather, intolerable after a week of rain. One dead rat in a wall, one blocked drain, one basket of fish, one feverish child, one wet fleece brought in too soon, and the whole sensory balance shifted. This constant instability is perhaps why descriptions from the past so often pay attention to air. Air was not empty. It was a medium carrying warning, comfort, contamination, and memory. A house could smell of a season, of a trade, of a family's means, of repeated meals, of smoke layered over many winters. And when travelers moved from one household to another, They were not just noticing furniture or manners. They were entering different atmospheres, literal and social at once. If we follow that idea a little further, we begin to see that smell also marked status in an unexpectedly powerful way. To enter a great hall perfumed with rushes newly laid, smoke rising high into open space, meat fresh on the board, and servants clearing refuse quickly was to encounter not just a richer smell but a different relationship to labor and waste. The unpleasant things had not disappeared. They had been managed, displaced, or masked by the work of others. That, too, was part of privilege. The poor lived closer to every stage of necessity. The wealthy could push some of it outward into kitchens, yards, service spaces, stables, and the bodies of servants. And yet, even in such settings, there remained one category of smell that was especially hard to escape, because it came not from poverty alone but from the structure of medieval settlement itself. Houses stood in streets that were narrow, crowded, and often saturated with the byproducts of daily life. In towns especially, the home was never an isolated bubble. Whatever happened outside had a way of pressing in through cracks, doorways, windows, drains, and shoes. Which means that to understand why the house smelled the way it did, we now have to step outside for a while, into the lane, the market, the yard, and the ditch where the domestic world met the public one. Which means that to understand why the house smelled the way it did, we now have to step outside for a while, into the lane, the market, the yard, and the ditch where the domestic world met the public one. There, the boundary between private discomfort and communal odor was much thinner than a modern viewer might expect. In many medieval towns, the street itself was an extension of household life. People cooked, traded, washed, slaughtered, repaired, dumped, bargained, argued, and moved animals through spaces that were also meant to carry rainwater and waste away. The street was not simply a passage between clean interiors. It was part of the same living system, and what gathered there rarely stayed neatly outside. This is one reason the smell of a medieval house cannot be separated from the smell of its neighborhood. A dwelling might be swept, aired, and managed with real effort, but if its doorway opened onto a lane churned by hooves, lined with refuse, and crossed by shallow drains, then the air entering the house brought that world with it. Shoes carried it in. Hemlines brushed through it. Wind pushed it under doors and through shutters. In hot weather it thickened. In rain it liquefied. In winter it froze and then returned. Domestic smell was therefore partly local geography. A home beside a fish market, a tannery quarter, a slaughter area, or a crowded urban ditch would live in an olfactory environment that no amount of sweet herbs could entirely defeat. To modern listeners, this can sound like unending chaos, but it is worth slowing down here because medieval towns did not usually operate without rules. Authorities often issued ordinances about dumping waste, cleaning gutters, keeping pigs from wandering too freely, regulating butchery, or forbidding the casting of offal into certain places. The fact that such rules appear so often tells us two things at once. First, people recognized the problem very clearly. Second, the problem persisted precisely because it was difficult to solve. Regulation is not evidence of cleanliness. It is often evidence of recurring failure. A town council could insist that householders clear the frontage of their properties or that butchers dispose of blood and entrails properly, but enforcement depended on habit, labor, expense, weather, and the simple stubbornness of daily life. And daily life produced a great deal of material. Human beings, animals, kitchens, workshops, and markets all generated waste faster than pre-modern infrastructure could gracefully absorb it. In the countryside, that waste might at least disperse into fields and yards with some space around it. In a compact town, it accumulated. Dung from horses, oxen, and pigs mixed with mud. Broken straw from carts and bedding broke down underfoot. Spilled grain attracted vermin. Fish scales, feathers, spoiled vegetables, and blood from slaughtering all had to be removed, reused, sold, buried, thrown out, or left too long. What failed to be managed immediately often began to smell almost at once. In narrow lanes with limited sunlight and poor drainage, odor did not merely pass through. Settled. That settlement mattered because medieval towns were rarely ventilated in the broad, open way modern cities can be. Streets could be close, overhanging, irregular, shadowed by upper stories, and clogged with activity. In such places, the smell of a single trade or a single neglected drain could seem to belong to the entire street. A row of houses might therefore share one atmosphere even if their inhabitants differed in wealth and habits. A careful housekeeper could improve her interior, but she could not command the lane beyond her threshold. That is another quiet but important reality of medieval smell. It was collective. They lived with the odors of neighbors, trades, animals, visitors, weather, and urban design. Market days intensified all of this. What seems romantic from a distance, stalls, carts, bustling squares, live poultry, fresh produce, salted fish, warm bread, ale, spices, cloth, leather, crowds, was in practice a dense sensory convergence. Some of it would have been lively and even pleasant in moments. Bread from an oven, apples in season, herbs crushed underfoot, wood smoke on a cold morning. But these gentler notes existed alongside dung, sweat, old cabbage leaves, fish left a little too long, damp wool, unwashed bodies in close proximity, and the sour residue of drink. The market was not a sanitized display of artisanal goods. It was commerce happening in real weather, among real animals over uneven ground, with limited means of refrigeration or separation. This is where a modern fantasy of the picturesque medieval town begins to give way. Stone buildings and timbered fronts may look charming to us now, partly because we meet them restored, emptied of labor, and stripped of their original environment. We visit them as architecture. Medieval people encountered them as active containers of life, and life smelled. A street of handsome facades could still conceal latrines, drains, middens, cesspits, crowded sleeping spaces, smoky workshops, and storerooms where food hovered between preservation and spoilage. Beauty and bad smell were not opposites. They could coexist quite easily, especially when a building's visual order depended on constant, invisible work behind the scenes. The yard behind the house where one existed offers another revealing example. To modern minds, a yard suggests air, openness, perhaps relief from the interior. In a medieval setting, it was often all of that, and yet also the place where many necessary but unpleasant tasks were handled. Ashes might be tipped there. Water might be thrown there after washing. Chickens scratched there. Wood was stacked. Waste was gathered. A privy might stand nearby. Scraps could attract dogs or pigs. Hides might dry in certain districts. Laundry could air if weather allowed, but so could dung and stagnant puddles. The yard was not a garden in the later suburban sense. It was a working edge between dwelling and survival, and because it was so useful, it easily became one of the strongest sources of smell entering the house from behind as the street did from the front. Even the ditch deserves attention, because ditches appear again and again in the practical life of medieval settlements. They drained land, marked property, received runoff, and sometimes collected much more than they were ever meant to hold. A ditch, in theory, was movement. Water would carry things away. A ditch in practice could become a long open reminder that flow had failed. Stagnant water, rotting vegetation, kitchen refuse, manure, and sewage all produced a smell that contemporaries certainly noticed. If a house stood near such a feature, especially in warm weather, the air inside could never be entirely independent of it. This was not because people enjoyed living that way. It was because drainage was hard, land was uneven, maintenance was imperfect, and rain had a habit of exposing every weakness in the built environment. One of the strongest retention points in this whole subject is the simple realization that medieval domestic smell was seasonal in a way modern people rarely experience. Summer heat could make urban odors bloom with startling force. Waste decomposed faster. Meat spoiled more quickly. Water turned foul more readily. Flies multiplied. A closed house could become oppressive not only with heat, but with the intensified scent of every object in it: rushes, clothing, bedding, timber, stored food, chamber vessels, and human bodies. Yet winter brought its own burden. Cold trapped people indoors with smoke, damp wool, wet shoes by the hearth, and reduced ventilation. Spring was not automatically fresh either. It could reveal what winter had hidden. Soaked ground, softened middens, drains choked with debris, mold returning to walls, and the general loosening of things half preserved by frost. Rain, perhaps more than any other ordinary event, changed everything. Rain drove mud into streets and homes. It swelled timber, soaked thatch, dampened bedding, and made yards heavy underfoot. It reanimated old smells that dry weather had muted. Manure dissolved and spread. Ditches overflowed. A midden that had been merely unpleasant became active again. Wet wool steamed by the fire. Rushes on the floor went sour more quickly. Even walls began to exhale that ancient mineral organic scent of damp enclosure. A listener today might think chiefly of dirt, but damp was often worse than dirt because damp entered materials and stayed there. It made homes smell not just untidy, but inhabited by the weather itself. And weather, of course, shaped the behavior of the people inside. A household pinned indoors by rain would generate more cooking odors, more body heat, more smoke, more breath, more use of chamber pots, more wear on floor coverings, and less opportunity to air bedding or textiles. In that sense, the smell of the medieval house was dynamic, constantly responding to pressure from outside and activity within. It did not remain fixed. It thickened and thinned with the day. Morning might begin with damp ashes, stale breath, and overnight waste. Noon with stew, smoke, and sweat. Evening with animals settled nearby, wet garments steaming, and the accumulated residue of work. The house was less like a static object than a breathing organism, one whose atmosphere changed as each task was added to it. This becomes even clearer when we think about crowding. Medieval households could be crowded not only because families were large, but because servants, apprentices, lodgers, laborers, kin, or travelers might also pass through the same space. An urban artisan's house, for instance, might include the master's family, one or more apprentices, perhaps a servant, and customers coming and going below while domestic life continued above or behind. Every extra body added warmth, breath, laundry, food needs, and waste. Crowding also reduced the chance that any room or bedding would truly rest. Things were always in use, always holding traces of the last person and the next. This is why smell can tell us so much about social structure. A wealthy household could distribute people across chambers and service areas. An ordinary one often could not. Privacy, in the modern sense, was limited. The smells of labor, illness, intimacy, food, and fatigue all circulated more freely because domestic boundaries were porous. A child's sickness altered the whole room. A servant returning from the yard altered the whole room. A pan of onions or fish altered the whole room. Nothing remained entirely personal when air itself was shared so closely. In that way, smell was one of the great facts of medieval communal living. There is also something unexpectedly revealing in the role of animals within towns. Medieval urban space was not purely human. Horses were essential. Carts moved goods. Poultry appeared in courtyards and markets. Pigs, despite repeated attempts to control them in many places, could wander or be kept in ways that made practical sense to owners and maddening sense to everyone else. Dogs roamed. Cats hunted vermin around stores of grain and food. The scent of animal life was therefore not confined to farms. It ran through urban domesticity as well. A respectable street might still smell of horse dung and wet leather. A yard behind a decent house might still carry the unmistakable note of poultry and feed. Again, the point is not that medieval people failed to notice. It is that useful animals and clean air were difficult to keep separate. And sometimes usefulness itself became a trap. Take manure. To modern urban minds, it is simply filth. To medieval households and communities, it could also be a resource, fuel in some contexts, fertilizer in others, part of the broader economy of reuse that defined pre-modern life. The same was true of scraps, bones, rags, grease, and ash. Much that smelled bad still had value. That fact slowed removal. A pile of waste was not always waiting to be discarded forever. It might be accumulating for later use, sale, or transport. The result, once again, was that the boundary between necessary resource and offensive nuisance could be deeply uncomfortable. The medieval world recycled constantly, but recycling has a smell when done without sealed containers, trucks, and industrial processing. It is tempting at this point to imagine everyone simply numbed by the constant presence of odor, but that would flatten the emotional reality too much. People still recoiled. They still preferred some streets to others. Visitors still judged places by what they sensed. Religious writers still used stench as a moral image precisely because the physical experience was so vivid. Medical thinking still treated corrupted air seriously. Household advice still recommended airing, strewing, washing, fumigating, and careful management. Smell offended because it mattered. A foul lane could feel like evidence that civic order was slipping. A sweetened chamber could feel like protection, status, and temporary relief. And that relief was often temporary in a very literal sense. One of the least romantic truths about medieval towns is that improvement was fragile. A cleared gutter clogged again. Fresh rushes went stale. A swept floor was muddied by the next arrival. A well-emptied cesspit filled again. A room aired in the morning could be smoky by nightfall. This does not make medieval people uniquely dirty. It makes them recognizably human, living with systems that required endless maintenance and rarely stayed solved for long. What feels especially modern is not cleanliness itself but durability, the ability to clean once and keep things acceptably clean with relatively little effort. Medieval households did not possess that advantage. And when maintenance failed, even briefly, vermin often entered the story. Rats and mice were drawn to grain, scraps, walls, and warmth. Fleas and lice found crowded bodies and bedding hospitable. Their presence added not just discomfort but further smell through droppings, nesting, contamination, and the slow ruin of stored goods. A dead rodent in a wall or under floor rushes could transform part of a house into a mystery of sour decay until found, if it was found at all. Here again, what sounds like a small domestic nuisance could alter the sensory world of an entire room. A medieval house was always vulnerable to such intrusions because so much of it was made of organic, penetrable materials. Perhaps the most striking thing, once all this is taken together, is how much effort was required simply to keep a home from tipping into offensive disorder. A housekeeper, a servant, a wife, a child helping with chores, an apprentice told to clear the front. All were part of an ongoing battle that had no final victory. Sweep, air, carry, empty, dry, replace, rinse, scatter herbs, relight the fire, shift the bedding, scrape the bowl, clean the pot, clear the drain. And after all of that, the house might still smell of smoke, damp, food, bodies, and the town beyond its walls. Yet within that effort there was also pride. A well-managed house, even one that would shock modern noses, represented discipline, labor, and care. It may not have smelled good by our standards, but it smelled better than neglect. Better than poverty without remedy. Better than sickness left unmanaged. Better than spoiled stores, blocked drains, or an overfull privy. Smell, in other words, helped medieval people distinguish between conditions that were merely normal and conditions that were becoming dangerous. The nose was not a useless organ defeated by the age. It was part of the household's warning system, and once we understand that, another door opens. Because the question is no longer only why medieval houses smelled worse than we think. It is also why certain smells were tolerated, why others caused alarm, and how people in the Middle Ages connected odor to disease itself, especially in moments when sickness seemed to move through towns on the air. That is where the story becomes even more revealing, because the smell of the medieval home was never just domestic. It was also entangled with fear. It was also entangled with fear, not the loud, cinematic fear that modern storytelling often prefers, but the quieter, more intimate kind that enters domestic life by degrees. A room begins to smell wrong. A drain seems more offensive than usual. Bedding that ought to be aired cannot be aired because someone is too ill to leave it. A child's breath changes. A corner of the house feels sour and close after days of poor weather. A neighbor speaks of fever 2 lanes away. In a world without microscopes, people still observed that sickness seemed to cluster in certain environments, and one of the most obvious signs of a dangerous environment was bad air. Smell therefore occupied an uneasy space between daily nuisance and genuine anxiety. This is where medieval ideas about miasma, corruption, and putrefaction begin to matter, though they should not be treated too casually. People did not all share one neat theory, and learned medicine, household wisdom, and religious language did not always overlap perfectly. But broadly speaking, many accepted that corrupted air could harm the body. Rotting matter, stagnant water, crowded rooms, and foul vapors were not merely unpleasant companions to disease. They seemed capable of helping cause it. That belief was not foolish in the way modern hindsight sometimes suggests. Even if the mechanisms were misunderstood, the patterns were often real. Places with poor sanitation, stagnant waste, bad drainage, and close quarters often were dangerous. So when medieval people feared bad smells, they were not reacting to odor alone. They were reacting to the possibility that smell signaled an invisible threat inside the house that made the management of air feel urgent in moments of illness. Windows might be opened if weather allowed. Herbs or resins might be burned. Vinegar, smoke, flowers, or aromatic substances could be used in attempts to cleanse the atmosphere. Bedding might be shifted, rushes changed, clothing aired, chambers fumigated. None of this guaranteed safety, of course, but it made sense within the logic of the time. A sick room was not just a room containing a patient. It was a room whose entire atmosphere had become suspect. The smell of fever, sweat, vomit, soiled linen, and stale air could quickly turn ordinary domestic discomfort into something heavier, more ominous. That is one of the deeper reasons medieval houses may have smelled worse than people imagine. They were not only places where ordinary life accumulated. They were places where crisis accumulated too. Illness did not go to a sterile hospital wing by default. Childbirth did not take place in a specialized clinic with washable surfaces and controlled ventilation. Old age, infection, diarrheal disease, injuries, and death itself all came into the home. The house held them, often with remarkable endurance and care, but also with smells that modern buildings are specifically designed to banish. In this sense, the medieval home was asked to perform too many roles at once. Nursery, infirmary, kitchen, workshop, dormitory, storehouse, refuge, and sometimes mortuary. The mention of death matters more than it may seem at first. Medieval people encountered death far more directly than most people in wealthy modern societies do, and the home was one of the places where this reality pressed closest. A dying person might remain in the house for days. A body might be laid out there before burial. The scents associated with sickness, incense, candles, sweat, linen, and the beginning edge of bodily change if circumstances delayed burial even briefly, would not have been abstract. They belonged to family memory. Smell, perhaps more than sight, attaches itself to memory with peculiar persistence. A room could carry the trace of an illness long after the event itself had passed. And yet, just as in the rest of the story, it would be too simple to say that medieval homes were only oppressive. What made them powerful spaces, and often emotionally rich ones, was precisely that the same room could contain warmth, prayer, food, labor, care, and discomfort all at once. A smoky house where bedding smelled of wool and rushes had also sheltered children through winter nights. A kitchen rich with grease and stale ale had also fed the household. A chamber heavy with illness might also be a place of astonishing tenderness. The smells were real, and often bad by modern standards, but they belonged to environments in which survival, affection, duty, and endurance were densely packed together. Still, the fear of corrupted air could change behavior in significant ways, especially during outbreaks of epidemic disease. In plague years, or when other contagious illnesses spread through a town, smell became even more morally and medically charged. Streets, houses, refuse heaps, drains, cemeteries, and even other bodies were interpreted through the language of corruption and vapor. Householders might intensify efforts to clean, sweeten, or isolate particular spaces. Municipal authorities might order streets cleared, waste removed, carcasses disposed of more quickly, or fires lit to purify the air. The aim was not simply tidiness. It was protection. Air had become suspect, and because the house breathed the air of the town, the home could never be completely sealed off from communal danger. This is another moment where modern assumptions can quietly fall away. We often imagine medieval medicine as entirely detached from practical observation, as though people simply reached for superstition where evidence failed. But much of what they did in response to foul domestic conditions, improve ventilation, remove rotting matter, avoid stagnant places, sweeten enclosed rooms, reduce crowding where possible, was not irrational behavior. It was incomplete, sometimes misguided, but often rooted in careful sensory attention. They could not see bacteria, but they could see decay, smell putrefaction, and notice that certain places felt more dangerous than others. In that sense, the medieval nose, imperfect but alert, was part of a broader attempt to map risk. For ordinary households, though, the problem remained brutally practical. You could believe foul air was harmful and still be unable to escape it. A poor family could not always move to a drier house. A widow could not simply rebuild the drainage. A laborer could not afford endless changes of straw, linen, or clothing. A town dweller living above a workshop near a crowded lane could not relocate because the ditch smelled bad in summer. Medical ideas might sharpen awareness, but they could also sharpen helplessness. To know that damp, foul, stagnant air was dangerous, and still spend winter in a smoky, cramped room with insufficient means to improve it, was its own kind of burden. This burden was felt differently across the social scale. Wealthier people had more options. They might withdraw from a city during times of epidemic, move between residences, maintain larger and better-aired chambers, burn more expensive aromatics, commission repairs, or rely on servants to maintain a level of domestic order that others had to produce with their own exhausted hands. But even wealth had limits. Stone could stay cold and damp. Tapestries trapped odors. Great halls filled with bodies and smoke during feasts. Latrine systems in castles and manor houses were ingenious at times, yet not free from failure or smell. Perfumes and incense did not eliminate the material realities of a pre-modern building. They sat beside them, sometimes beautifully, sometimes desperately. In fact, some of the most luxurious domestic spaces could be surprisingly odorous for precisely this reason. Rich fabrics, padded furnishings, fur-lined garments, feather beds, stored clothes, and enclosed chambers all held scent. A noble household possessed more objects capable of absorbing smoke, oils, damp, and bodily presence. The result might be less raw than in a poor cottage, but not necessarily cleaner in the modern sense. If anything, elite smell could be more layered. Wax, perfume, wine, roasting meat, rushes, wool, sweat beneath fine linen, old smoke in tapestries, damp stone after rain, dogs lying near the fire, and privies in adjoining structures all contributed to a complex domestic atmosphere. The difference was not the absence of odor, but the ability to control, soften, and distance its harsher forms. And this ability to distance is worth dwelling on, because it reveals something larger about medieval society. Smell was part of inequality. The rich were not magically odorless, but they could move unpleasant tasks and materials away from their own immediate senses. Waste could be carried off by others. Animals could be kept farther from main chambers. Kitchens could be placed apart. Clothing could be changed more often. Bedding could be remade. Floors could be covered afresh. Servants could attend to chamber pots, ash disposal, rush replacement, laundry, and the airing of rooms. None of that erased smell, but it redistributed exposure. The poor inhaled necessity more directly. That same inequality appears in towns when we consider who lived nearest the most offensive trades and spaces. Districts associated with tanning, butchery, dyeing, or other pungent work were not randomly assigned in lived experience, even where regulations tried to manage them. Some neighborhoods simply bore more of the sensory cost of urban survival than others. If one family's home stood near a cleaner commercial center and another's beside a drainage channel, the difference would shape not only comfort but health, reputation, and the perceived quality of daily life. A house's smell could mark its place in the social landscape as surely as its size or building materials. Yet medieval people also possessed a remarkable capacity to create islands of sensory relief within difficult environments. This is one of the quieter and more human parts of the story. A washed linen cloth laid out in sunlight. A bench pulled toward a doorway for fresher air. Herbs strewn on a floor before guests arrive. Fresh rushes cut and brought in. A garment hung where smoke may dry but not overwhelm it. A bowl rinsed well. A child washed more carefully when fever threatens. A chamber aired after days of rain. These acts did not transform the house into a modern clean room, but they mattered. They made domestic life more bearable. They were also expressions of dignity. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to speak of medieval smell in a way that turns the past into a spectacle of discomfort. But the people living there were not side characters in a lesson about hygiene. They were householders working constantly against limits. That is why the most trustworthy way to picture a medieval home is not as a caricature of filth, nor as a romantic cottage lifted from a modern fantasy illustration, but as a place of continual management. Things had to be watched, water fetched, ash cleared, bedding turned, spoilage detected, waste moved, air invited in when possible, warmth retained when necessary. A good household was not one that defeated smell forever. It was one that kept smell from becoming intolerable, dangerous, or dishonorable. And sometimes, despite all effort, the house crossed that line. A failed cesspit, a season of relentless rain, animals too close by necessity, illness, poverty, overcrowding, contaminated water, rotting stores, or the simple accumulation of labor beyond one family's capacity could make a dwelling truly oppressive. In those moments, smell became evidence that the household was under strain, not necessarily because anyone was lazy or careless, but because the margin between order and disorder was narrow. Medieval domestic life often depended on maintaining that margin every single day. When work failed for even a short time, the house announced it. This is one reason written complaints about stink can sound so intense. People were not merely expressing delicate preference. They were reacting to the collapse of boundaries that mattered. Between edible and spoiled, healthy and corrupted, respectable and neglected, private and public, household and midden. A foul smell crossing into the house suggested that one or more of those boundaries had weakened. Something was getting in or something was not being properly sent away. That made smell a social fact as much as a physical one. It touched on competence, morality, neighborly duty, and vulnerability. Neighborly duty in particular becomes more interesting the closer we look. Because air moved, drainage connected properties, and streets were shared, one household's habits could become another's misery. If a neighbor neglected a gutter, dumped waste improperly, kept animals badly, or allowed a ditch to stagnate, others had to endure the consequences. This produced disputes, petitions, ordinances, and resentments. The medieval house was therefore never entirely sovereign over its own scent. It was embedded in a local ecology of responsibility and failure. Even the best-kept home might suffer from another person's pigsty, another person's drain, another person's pile of refuse left too long in warm weather. And the church, too, was not absent from this sensory world. Religious spaces had their own smellscapes, incense, candles, damp stone, old wood, bodies gathered in prayer. But religious thought also shaped how people interpreted foul domestic environments. Corruption of the flesh, the sweetness of sanctity, the stench of sin, the cleansing of air, the purity of the household. All these metaphors resonated because they were grounded in daily physical experience. A person who knew the sharp warning of rot or stale air did not need a theologian to explain why stench made such a vivid moral symbol. The material and the spiritual were never entirely separate here. Domestic odor helped furnish the language with which people imagined moral order itself. At the same time, religion could also offer practical rhythm. Feast days, fasting periods, rituals of cleansing, charity to the sick, and care for the dying all moved through households. Smell followed each of them. Food changed with the calendar. Crowds gathered on holy days. Candles were lit. Incense was encountered by some more than others. The medieval home did not exist apart from sacred time, and sacred time had its own sense that mingled with the everyday. That contrast between the sweet and the sour, the fragrant and the corrupt, must have been felt very strongly in a world where odor had such immediate force. Perhaps this is why some of the most revealing domestic details are the smallest ones. Not the dramatic image of a whole city reeking, but the cloth held to the nose in a bad street, the handful of mint in a chamber, the window open despite the cold, the complaint about a neighbor's ditch, the servant carrying out a pot before dawn, the new rushes laid before a festival or visit, the wet boots drying too near the bed, the summer anxiety about meat, the winter heaviness of smoke in rafters. These are not grand historical events, and yet they tell us how the medieval house actually felt to live in. Always adjusting, always compensating, always balancing comfort against necessity. And beneath all of it, the most persistent truth remains that medieval houses smelled worse than modern viewers usually imagine, not because medieval people were exceptionally indifferent, but because their homes were asked to absorb functions that modern infrastructure now hides. Our drains vanish into walls. Our waste leaves the house quickly. Our smoke is vented. Our water arrives under pressure. Our laundry can be washed and dried with relative ease. Our floors are made not to absorb broth, dung, or damp rush water. Our buildings separate pets, cooking, sanitation, sleep, and work far more aggressively. Once those invisible systems are mentally removed, the medieval house stops seeming surprisingly bad and starts seeming structurally destined to smell. But structural destiny is not the same as total sameness, and that is where the story becomes even more intimate. Because if we move from the town back inside specific rooms, and from general atmosphere back into the daily rhythm of an ordinary household from dawn to night, we can begin to see how the smell of a medieval home changed hour by hour, task by task, and person by person. That slower domestic rhythm reveals something even stranger than the general stink. The fact that some of the worst smells emerged not from exceptional neglect, but from the most ordinary routine imaginable. The fact that some of the worst smells emerged not from exceptional neglect, but from the most ordinary routine imaginable, is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. Medieval domestic life was full of perfectly sensible actions that, repeated day after day in a confined space, produced an atmosphere modern people would find exhausting. So if we slow the pace and spend a single day inside an ordinary household, not a fantasy cottage, not a palace, but a believable lived-in home somewhere in medieval Europe, the smell of the place becomes easier to understand. It was not one odor waiting in the doorway. It was a sequence. Before dawn, the house would often still hold the stale remains of the night. The fire might have sunk low, leaving damp ash, cold smoke, and that faint mineral scent of embers that have almost died but not quite. The air near the bed would be close with breath, wool, linen, and the warmth of bodies that had slept together for practical reasons as much as comfort. Curtains, if there were any, would have trapped that air. Blankets and straw-filled mattresses would have taken in moisture during the night and released it slowly into the room. If chamber pots had been used, as they very often were in darkness, cold, or bad weather, their presence would already have altered the atmosphere before anyone had properly risen. Morning, then, did not begin in freshness. It began in accumulated human closeness. Bedding had to be shaken or aired if possible. Embers had to be coaxed back into flame. Pots had to be emptied, benches reset, the floor disturbed. And as soon as movement began, the house changed. A room that had smelled stale and sleeping started to smell smoky, because the first task in many households was restoring the fire. Smoke rose into air that was still heavy from the night. If kindling was damp, the smoke could be especially sharp. If the chimney drew poorly, or if there was no proper chimney at all, the room would fill before it cleared. Clothing put back on after sleep brought its own smell of old wool, sweat, and smoke from previous days. Boots or shoes pulled near the hearth to soften or dry added leather and mud to the mix. Breakfast, when there was one in the form we might recognize, did not clean the air either. Porridge, pottage, reheated bread, ale, onions, cheese, or scraps from earlier meals all released scents that settled quickly into rooms already marked by ash and breath. Medieval food was practical, often nourishing, sometimes surprisingly varied, but it was not neutral smelling. Boiled grains, fermented drink, garlic, stored dairy, and salted foods each had force. The first pot of the day might seem modest, but in a small dwelling modest smells did not disperse gently. They entered cloth, hair, rushes, and walls. If the meal was cooked over an indoor hearth, the scent of food and smoke became almost inseparable. That is the first daily pattern worth noticing. The house rarely reset to zero. Morning did not erase yesterday. It layered on top of it. The ashes from last night, the mustiness in the bedding, the stale pot waiting to be emptied, the damp floor near the door, the old smoke in the rafters, and then the new smoke, the new cooking, the new traffic, all of it formed one continuous atmosphere. Modern people are used to systems that clear the air between uses. Medieval households usually lived inside continuity. Once the household was fully awake, labor began to divide the space in still more complicated ways. Someone might be mending near a window, spinning wool, scraping a bowl, feeding children, sorting stores, cutting bread, sweeping rushes, carrying water, or stepping in and out to the yard. Each task had a smell, however slight. Wool carried oil and lanolin. Water from a bucket or barrel might smell faintly of wood, standing storage, or the source it came from. A damp cloth used for wiping did not smell like a sterile modern cleaning rag. It smelled of repeated use. Even sweeping a floor could release old odors rather than remove them. Dust, crushed herbs from earlier strewing, dried mud, soot, food particles, and animal traces all rose when disturbed. There is something quietly relentless about that. Cleaning itself could smell bad. To shift old rushes was to release what they had trapped. To move bedding was to stir the body scent absorbed into it. To scrub with limited water in a damp room could produce not freshness but a temporary sourness as dirt, soap, ash, and organic residue mixed together. Medieval people understood this perfectly well. Household work was not magic. It was management. It brought improvement, but often through unpleasant intermediate stages. If the household included children, the day became even more olfactory. Infants required cloths, feeding, carrying, and all the bodily unpredictability that comes with early life. Toddlers crossed floors before they were truly clean, touched animals, fell into mud, cried near the fire, spilled food, and added disorder faster than it could be undone. A sick child altered the whole house more than almost any object could. Sour milk breath, fever sweat, soiled cloth, the smell of vomit or diarrhea, all of this was contained not in an isolated nursery with washable surfaces, but in the same domestic sphere where food still had to be prepared and work still had to continue. The house bent around these events, but it could not separate them cleanly. By mid-morning or noon, depending on season and household routine, the smell of work from outside might begin returning indoors. A family member coming in from the fields or from a yard could carry wet earth, animal scent, cut vegetation, or manure on boots and hems. An artisan might re-enter with traces of the workshop on clothes and hands. Metal, oil, dye, dust, fish, leather, whatever trade shaped the household economy. Medieval domestic interiors were not protected from occupation. They were extensions of it. If the family made its living with animals, grain, cloth, brewing, or labor in wet weather, the house knew it immediately. This is also the part of the day when the role of the doorway becomes so revealing. Modern homes tend to treat the front door as a sealed barrier. Medieval doors, thresholds, shutters, and openings were far more active points of exchange. Smells crossed there constantly. Fresh air entered, but so did the street. A neighbor passing with a cart, animals being driven by, runoff thickening after rain, a nearby workshop firing up, fish being unloaded, smoke drifting from another hearth. All of that could move into the house in passing waves. If there was relief in opening the dwelling to air, there was also risk. You let freshness in, but you did not entirely choose what kind. Around the main meal, the house often reached one of its strongest daily concentrations of scent. Cooking was heat, steam, fat, smoke, and food storage all activated at once. A pottage bubbling for some time, perhaps with cabbage, onion, pulses, bits of meat if fortune allowed, or fish if the calendar or local custom dictated, could create a smell that was hearty in theory and oppressive in practice once mingled with everything else. Bread warm from baking was pleasant, but baking also meant flour, ash, sweat, heat, and smoke. Frying, where it occurred, intensified grease in the air. Boiling softened ingredients while thickening the atmosphere. In cold weather this may have been welcome at first. In warmer conditions it turned rooms heavy. The interesting reversal here is that the most homely smells in the medieval house were not always the easiest to live with. We often imagine the smell of stew or bread as comforting because we encounter it briefly, in clean spaces, against a background of fresh air. But if that same smell is added to damp wool, unemptied waste, old smoke, packed bodies, animal traces from outside, and the mustiness of stored food, it becomes something else. It becomes endurance. What looks wholesome in isolation may become tiring in accumulation. After the meal came another transition and another wave of smells. Scraps had to be dealt with. Bowls and pots had to be rinsed or scraped. Grease clung to surfaces. Ale spilled on tables or floors did not vanish. It soaked, dried, and then contributed to the room later. Fish bones, vegetable peelings, stale bread fragments, and broth thickening in the bottom of a pot all had their own timetable of decay. If they were quickly carried out, the house improved. If not, even for a few hours, flies and sourness began their work. In that sense, the domestic rhythm of smell depended partly on how quickly labor could keep pace with use. And labor did not always keep pace. One of the most trustworthy things we can say about medieval households is that they were often tired. People had too much to do. Water had to be fetched from somewhere outside. Fuel had to be gathered, bought, chopped, dried, or rationed. Work beyond the home still demanded time. Cooking, mending, childcare, animal care, and food preservation did not politely schedule themselves one at a time. So a house could smell worse simply because one or two necessary tasks had been delayed by 5 other urgent ones. An overfull slop bucket, damp linen waiting for a better day, a floor not properly swept until evening. These do not point to indifference. They point to pressure. Afternoon brought its own domestic chemistry. If weather was fair, this was one of the best chances to improve a house. Bedding might be brought out or at least opened. A garment could be aired. Doors and shutters might stay wider for longer. Herbs could be cut, brought in, or replaced. Water might be used more freely if labor allowed. But fair weather also made outside smells more active. Sun warming a midden, a ditch, a stable area, or a row of houses could drive odors inward just as surely as wind could carry them away. Relief was therefore conditional. A bright day did not guarantee a sweet-smelling home. It simply changed the balance of what came to dominate. If rain arrived, the entire sensory map shifted again. Wet people came in carrying the outdoors with them. Cloaks and woolen garments hung near the fire to steam. Footwear softened and gave off leather, mud, and animal residue. Dogs or other domestic animals that sheltered near or within the house added wet fur to the room. Water tracked across the floor woke old smells from rushes and earth. Smoke might grow thicker if the fire struggled or the draft changed. The room then became a place where weather, clothing, fuel, and body heat met in a kind of damp compression. This may be one of the hardest atmospheres for a modern listener to imagine accurately, because we have all smelled versions of it: wet coats, old fireplaces, muddy boots, overheated fabric, but usually only briefly. In a medieval house, it could persist for days. And then there were the less visible, slower odors that accompanied storage through the day. Grain bins, barrels, cheese, hanging meat, dried peas, onions, garlic, herbs, vinegar, ale, and whatever was being kept against future need did not wait quietly. They contributed continuously. A cupboard or chest, once opened, released not only the smell of its contents but of the wood and damp surrounding them. A sack of grain might smell wholesome until the first hint of spoilage or vermin reached it. A cheese might be perfectly edible and still forceful. Salt fish stored for necessity did not pretend to be delicate. Medieval houses were full of food at different stages of life and preservation, and those stages had scents all their own. The same was true of textiles. Linen washed recently and dried well could bring real freshness into the room, but not every textile could be kept in that state. Wool held on to smoke and body oils stubbornly. Cloaks worn outdoors came back with rain, horse, mud, and wrote on them. Mattress stuffing aged. Hanging fabrics gathered soot. Curtains around beds or doorways protected from cold but also stored air that had already been breathed many times. Clothing chests could become little climates of their own, shut too tightly against one danger and not tightly enough against another. So even in moments of relative quiet, when no cooking was happening and no one was sweeping or emptying waste, the house still smelled of what it held. Toward evening, the daily cycle narrowed once more. People returned. Animals settled. The fire was renewed. The meal, if not already taken, added another layer of food and smoke. A house that had briefly opened itself to the day began closing again against darkness and cold. This was sensible and necessary, but it also meant that whatever odors had accumulated now stayed with the household more completely. Night intensified enclosure. The same walls that protected against wind also kept in breath, soot, fatigue, and bodily presence. A room after sunset might smell heavier not because anything especially foul had happened, but because all the day's minor traces had finally been sealed together. This is why the medieval evening, for all its quietness, may have been one of the most concentrated times for domestic smell. People sat close to the hearth. Clothing warmed and released whatever the day had left in it. Children dozed or were put to bed without the modern routine of soap, brushing, running water, and heated bathrooms intervening between labor and sleep. Feet sore from work, hands worn by tools, hair touched by smoke, cloaks dampened by weather, all entered the night almost as they were. There may have been small acts of washing, combing, changing linen where possible, but the house did not undergo a modern reset before bed. Instead, it gradually turned from a workplace back into a sleeping place without ceasing to be either. That transition is one of the more quietly uncomfortable features of pre-modern domestic life. The room in which food had simmered, leather had dried, children had played, tools had been handled, and waste had temporarily waited was often not far removed from the room in which bodies now lay down to rest. The sensory boundary between day and night was far less absolute than ours. We moved from kitchen to bathroom to bedroom, each climate-controlled, each cleaned according to different standards. Medieval households often moved through one or two environments that had to do everything. No wonder the smell remained persistent. It had nowhere else to go. And yet, even here there is nuance, because people did create rituals of night order where they could. Embers were banked, doorways secured, bedding arranged. Some households aired what they could before shutting up. Better-off families might withdraw into chambers relatively separate from the main living space. Monastic or elite routines imposed other patterns of order. But for ordinary households, especially in harsher weather, the night often meant accepting a degree of closeness modern people would find startling. The room became warmer, darker, softer perhaps, but not cleaner in our sense. In fact, sleep itself prepared the conditions for the next morning's first stale wave of air. What makes this daily rhythm so historically powerful is that it reveals smell not as an occasional flaw in medieval housing, but as one of its ordinary textures. The home smelled in the morning because people had slept there. It smelled at noon because food was being made there. It smelled in the afternoon because labor returned there. It smelled at night because bodies gathered there again. Even success, warmth, food, shelter, productive work was inseparable from odor. That is the deeper irony. The better a household functioned as a machine for survival, the more constantly it generated smells. And still, some routines were worse than others. Laundry days, brewing days, slaughtering days, preserving days, and winter weeks when nothing dried properly could transform a house from bearable to oppressive. A batch of ale gone wrong, a pot forgotten too long, a child ill with stomach trouble, a chicken brought briefly indoors, a pair of soaked boots left near bedding. Any of these could tip the balance. The fragility of comfort is what makes the medieval home feel so different from ours. It did not need a catastrophe to smell bad. It needed only ordinary life plus a few small inconveniences landing on the same day. If we want to understand what medieval people themselves would have noticed most sharply, it may not have been the baseline atmosphere they lived within every day, but those moments of change. The house smells wrong today. The bedding is too damp. The milk has turned sooner than expected. The drain is backing up. The rushes need changing. The weather has trapped the smoke low. Something in the wall has died. The privy is too full. A neighbor's refuse is drifting this way. That is how smell became information. It was not merely an unpleasant backdrop. It was a running commentary on the state of the home. And that commentary could be deeply personal. A careful housekeeper might feel shame if guests noticed a sour chamber. A servant might be blamed for neglecting a task that no one had time to finish properly. A family already under financial strain might sense its hardship most vividly not in abstract numbers, but in the way the house failed to clear, dry, or sweeten as it once had. Smell therefore belonged to emotion as well as environment. Touched pride, anxiety, fatigue, and social standing. To say that a medieval house smelled worse than people think is true. But it is more revealing to say that the smell of a house could tell its inhabitants, hour by hour, how well life was holding together. And once you look at it that way, another subtle question emerges. If ordinary routine itself produced such a dense atmosphere, then what happened in those particular parts of the house where routine concentrated most intensely? Not the whole home in general, but the bed, the hearth, the floor, the privy corner, the storage chest, the small semi-dark places where medieval smell did its most stubborn work. That is where the next layer of the story begins to narrow, and where the house starts to feel even closer. That is where the next layer of the story begins to narrow, and where the house starts to feel even closer. Once we move away from the broad idea of the medieval home, and look instead at its individual zones, the smell becomes more precise, and in some ways more unsettling. A whole house could smell bad in general, certainly, but what made it memorable, what made it cling to fabric, hair, and memory, were the concentrated pockets where material, moisture, heat, and repeated use met over long stretches of time. The floor, the bed, the hearth, the storage corner, the privy arrangement, the animal threshold, the wall itself. Each one had its own logic, and each one could quietly dominate the atmosphere of the room. Start with the floor, because the floor was far more active than modern listeners often imagine. In a contemporary house, the floor is designed to resist life. It is sealed, washable, inert. In a medieval dwelling, especially an ordinary one, the floor was often porous in one way or another. Earth floors could hold damp and accept whatever fell into them. Wooden floors, where present, still trapped dirt between boards and absorbed spills. Rushes, straw, or other strewing materials provided insulation and softness, but they also created a kind of living archive of the household's daily contact with the ground. Mud from boots, droplets of broth, crumbs, grease, ash, hair, dust, animal traces, and spilled ale did not vanish. They entered the floor's texture and stayed there until labor forced them out. And forcing them out was never simple. To sweep such a surface was useful, but only up to a point. Sweeping removed the larger visible matter first. It did not erase what had soaked in, dried, and merged with the material underfoot. If rushes were left too long, they became not merely untidy but sour, especially in damp conditions. If an earthen floor near the door took repeated wet traffic, it might carry a heavy smell of soil and decay whenever the weather changed. The floor beneath the hearth was another zone again, marked by ash, grease, dropped food, sparks, and the churning feet of people working near the fire. To walk across such a house was, in a sense, to walk across the record of recent living, and the floor gave some of that record back into the air each time it was disturbed. This is one of the least glamorous but most historically revealing truths about domestic smell. It rose from below as often as it drifted from above. When people moved through a room, They did not simply occupy its atmosphere. They activated it. The child running across old rushes, the woman sweeping near the table, the man stamping mud from boots by the door. All of them lifted stale particles and released old odors from material that had been pressed down for days or weeks. A room could therefore smell worse precisely when it was being tidied, used, or crowded. Stillness was not cleanliness, but disturbance could make the house announce what it had been holding. Then there was the bed, which in many ways was the most intimate and the most deceptive object in the house. To us, a bed suggests privacy, softness, perhaps the cleanest part of domestic life. In the medieval world, the bed could still be cherished, costly, protective, and emotionally important, but it was also a reservoir. Mattresses made from straw, flock, feathers, or wool stuffing absorbed the air of the room and the bodies that used them. Linen sheets, when available and properly cared for, were among the most effective tools of household cleanliness, but they too required work to wash, dry, bleach, and maintain. Blankets and coverlets took in smoke. Bed curtains, prized for warmth and privacy, could preserve stale air magnificently. The enclosed bed kept out drafts, but it also kept in breath, sweat, and the scent of long use. In colder seasons especially, that mattered a great deal. A family sleeping closely, or children joining adults during cold nights, created warmth by sharing what modern people spend architecture and technology trying to manage separately. Breath condensed into fabric. Dampness settled into stuffing. The next day, unless bedding could be opened, aired, beaten, or exposed to sun, the night remained within it. The bed did not return to neutrality on its own. A chamber that smelled slightly close by evening could smell heavily human by dawn. And if illness entered the bed, that concentration deepened further. Fever, soiled cloths, sweat, cough, blood, or vomiting turned the bed from a refuge into one of the most intense smell-holding spaces in the house. The hearth, by contrast, was the great transformer. Almost everything passed through it or near it sooner or later. Wet clothes dried by it. Food cooked over it. Light gathered around it. People sat beside it for warmth, repaired tools near it, and brought in fuel from outside for it. But for all its necessity, the hearth had a talent for producing residue. Smoke settled upward into rafters, later dropping its presence back into the room through cloth, soot, and the scent of old combustion. Animal fat cooking there could leave a greasy trace in the air. Damp wood created a more acrid smoke than dry wood. Peat, charcoal, brush, and other fuels each contributed differently. Ash collected and had to be moved. Sparks singed things. Pots blackened. The hearth made a home habitable, yet it also laid a long smoky claim over everything within reach. This is another place where modern memory misleads. Many people today like the smell of a fireplace because they meet it briefly by choice in clean homes with good ventilation. Medieval people often met it daily, whether they wanted to or not. Smoke was in the roof, in the cloth, in the food, in the hair, in the blanket, in the chest where clothing was stored, and sometimes in the lungs more than anyone would have wished. The pleasant and the oppressive sat very close together. A freshly lit fire on a cold evening was relief. A low smoky room after hours of poor draught was not. Near the hearth, too, gathered the tools and byproducts of cooking. Pots, ladles, knives, bowls, hooks, baskets, barrels, sacks, spits, and dripping cloths all participated in the house's smell. A pot rinsed but not fully scoured retained yesterday's meal. A board cut repeatedly for onions, fish, or meat carried its own ghost of use. A storage basket once holding garlic or dried fish did not become scentless because it was emptied, nor did the cupboard or chest in which such things were kept. Smell moved by contact. It passed from object to object in slow, ordinary ways, until the entire room had a kind of distributed memory of the foods most often eaten there. Storage corners deserve their own attention because they illustrate a special kind of medieval domestic pressure, the need to keep things just barely safe. Modern storage often means protection from inconvenience. Medieval storage often meant protection from hunger. Grain had to last. Salted foods had to remain edible. Cheese had to hold. Ale had to stay drinkable. Herbs had to dry well enough to matter later. That meant sacks, bins, tubs, crocks, hanging meats, root vegetables, onions, garlic, beans, dried peas, and every other form of preservation that a household could manage. But preservation was never odorless. It was a controlled resistance to spoilage, and that resistance generated a strong smell of its own. The storage corner of a house might therefore smell dry, sharp, sour, dusty, or musky, not because things had failed entirely, but because they were being held in suspension between harvest and need. And because food security was so important, households often tolerated smells in storage that a modern person would reject immediately. A cheese could be strong and still valuable. Cured meat could smell forceful and remain welcome. Onion strings, garlic, cabbages, and fermenting preparations all shaped the air. Even grain, ideally clean and dry, had a distinctive scent that changed if damp threatened it. The nose was essential here. A careful householder learned to distinguish the normal strong smell of kept food from the more worrying smell of real trouble. Mold, rot, infestation, sourness beyond usefulness. That distinction could mean the difference between prudence and waste, between salvage and hunger. The chest, perhaps more than any other single object, shows how domestic smell could be trapped in layers. Chests protected clothing, linens, valuables, documents, and foodstuffs from damp, pests, theft, and disorder. But a chest also enclosed whatever smell entered it. Wool placed away after weeks in a smoky room carried smoke with it. Linen stored not quite dry could sour. Leather belts, gloves, shoes, and pouches took on a dense warm smell of oil, sweat, and use. Herbs or lavender might be tucked in to improve matters, and sometimes did. Yet the very act of opening a chest could release a compressed little climate. Wood, fabric, iron fittings, closed air, lingering smoke, and whatever domestic life had lodged within the items now folded together. A tidy chest was not necessarily a fresh-smelling chest. The walls themselves were part of this sensory system. Wattle and daub, plaster, timber, limewash, stone. Each material met the environment differently, but none were inert in the modern industrial sense. Timber breathed with damp and dryness. Plaster cracked and held dust. Stone retained cold and exhaled moisture. Thatch above absorbed and released smell with weather and smoke. Insects nested. Mice moved through cavities. A wall could carry the scent of mildew after heavy rain or of old soot after a long winter. And because the walls enclosed everything else, they were not neutral boundaries. They were slow participants, taking in the life of the house and giving it back in altered form. This helps explain why some smells in medieval homes must have felt difficult to locate precisely. Not every bad smell came from an obvious visible source. Sometimes it was a vague sourness from damp materials. Sometimes it was the heavy note of a wall that had taken weather badly. Sometimes a dead creature under boards or in thatch imposed itself without immediate discovery. Sometimes a drain line or privy shaft near the structure sent up an intermittent warning only when conditions shifted. Medieval houses could therefore smell mysterious in the most uncomfortable sense. You knew something was wrong, but not always where to look first. The privy arrangement, of course, is one of the most obvious concentrations of smell, yet it becomes more interesting once we stop treating it as a cartoon. Where households had access to a proper latrine or cesspit system, the aim was distance and directed removal. Where they relied heavily on chamber pots and simpler outdoor arrangements, the aim was still control. But control was fragile. A privy too close to the house, too full, badly maintained, or poorly drained could push smell right back toward the domestic space it was supposed to protect. Chamber pots solved one immediate problem, especially at night, but postponed another until morning. And if weather, illness, darkness, or sheer fatigue delayed emptying, the house had to share air with that decision. Even where the privy itself stood somewhat apart, the path to it, the vessel used before or instead of it, the area where slops were emptied, and the soil around repeated disposal points all contributed to the home's smell profile. In wealthier households, servants might mediate this more consistently. In ordinary homes, the same hands that cooked, carried water, and minded children often dealt with waste too. The moral dimension of smell becomes very visible here. Respectability depended partly on how successfully a household moved waste away from sight and smell, but that success always rested on labor, often female labor, often low-status labor, often exhausting labor. And then there was the threshold where people and animals met. Even when animals were not literally sharing the main room, they were frequently close enough to matter. Boots carried stable dirt. Straw used for bedding or feed crossed into domestic space. Milk pails, harness, ropes, baskets, and tools came in from yards and byres. A dog sleeping near the fire, a cat moving through storage, a chicken briefly underfoot. These were not constant absurdities invented for comedy. They were familiar parts of a world in which human survival was tightly joined to animals. But the smell of that joining, fur, dung, feed, wet hide, sour milk, muddy hoof tracks, was real. It pressed at the edges of the house even when the main living area was kept as separate as means allowed. There is a deeper reason this mattered. Animal smell could be practical, even comforting in tiny doses, especially where it signaled warmth, food, transport, or security. Yet it also threatened the distinction between a managed household and a farmyard. A good home kept that line as clearly as possible. A struggling one saw it blur. If poultry droppings appeared too often near the threshold, if the smell of the byre drifted too strongly into the sleeping area, if feed and domestic food seemed too close together, then the house felt less controlled. Once again, smell was not just sensory. It measured the strength of boundaries. The same could be said of laundry, one of the most underappreciated smell battles in pre-modern life. Clean linen was one of the great achievements of the household, not because it created perfection, but because it interrupted accumulation. Linen shirts, shifts, towels, cloths, swaddling bands, sheets, and caps could be washed more regularly than heavier outer garments and thereby absorb some of the bodily oils and dirt that would otherwise remain on the person. But washing required water, fuel, tubs, labor, weather, soap or lye, and drying space. On wash days, the house or yard might smell sharply of heated water, lye, damp cloth, ash, and stirred dirt. For a time, things became worse in the process of becoming better. If weather turned against the household, laundry could become a source of misery rather than relief. Cloth hung indoors too long might sour. Half-dried linen could carry a cold, damp smell that no one welcomed. Wool rarely yielded easily to frequent washing, and when it did become wet, it dried slowly and retained odor. So even the presence of a relatively clean underlayer on the body did not transform the total sensory reality of the home. It helped, sometimes greatly, but it was part of a cycle, not an endpoint. Insects belong in this narrower domestic view as well, because they reveal how smell and material work together. Fleas in bedding, lice in clothing, flies near food scraps or waste, moths in cloth, all were more than nuisances. They pushed households to move, beat, air, smoke, wash, and inspect things repeatedly. Their presence changed what a bed or chest or rush-covered floor felt like, and probably what it smelled like too, though not always in a simple dramatic way. Infestation often announced itself through the deteriorating state of materials and the subtle change in their scent before any single source could be named. Again, the house demanded interpretation. One of the quietest but most consequential facts is that medieval domestic smell was rarely isolated to one object. The bed smelled partly because the room smelled. The room smelled partly because the floor held yesterday. The floor smelled partly because the door admitted the yard. The yard smelled partly because the household could not move all waste immediately. The storage corner smelled partly because preservation was essential. The hearth smelled because warmth and cooking depended on combustion. Each zone fed the others. This made improvement difficult, but it also explains why even conscientious households could feel permanently scented by life itself. That phrase, scented by life itself, sounds gentler than the reality often was, but it captures an important truth. Medieval homes smelled bad not only when things went wrong, but because normal functioning involved smoke, preservation, animal adjacency, human closeness, porous materials, irregular ventilation, and endless reuse. The house was an ecosystem of necessity. Modern people are used to homes designed around exclusion. Excluding waste, excluding moisture, excluding pests, excluding combustion byproducts, excluding outside dirt. Medieval homes were designed around endurance first, and exclusion only as far as resources allowed. This is why the semi-dark places of the house matter so much. Corners under benches, the space behind stored chests, the area beneath hanging cloth, the shaded patch near a wall where damp never fully lifted, the low part of the roof where smoke stained and insects settled. These were not dramatic locations, but they were where domestic history accumulated. Dust thickened there. Odors lingered there. A housekeeper might know exactly which corner turned sour first in bad weather, or which chest required airing on the first clear day, or which patch near the threshold needed fresh strewing because animals had been too near. The medieval house was not uniformly foul. It had trouble spots, and people knew them. That local knowledge created a kind of intimacy modern housing often lacks. To live in such a house was to know it with the nose as much as with the eyes. You knew when the hearth was drawing badly before you could explain why. You knew when bedding had crossed from ordinary closeness to unhealthy damp. You knew the smell of safe-stored grain and the first warning note of risk. You knew whether the privy was merely present or becoming intrusive. You knew whether the room smelled of rain in a tolerable way or in the deeper, more worrying way that suggested walls or thatch were failing somewhere. The house spoke constantly, and smell was one of its main languages. And that language, once learned, shaped behavior minute by minute. A shutter opened. A bucket carried out sooner than planned. Herbs replaced. Bedding turned. A child moved away from a cold wall. Pot scrubbed again. A floor layer changed. A chest left open for an hour. A cloak hung farther from the bed. Small corrections repeated endlessly. These are not dramatic enough to dominate popular images of the Middle Ages, yet they were probably central to daily life. Most medieval people did not wake each morning thinking in grand categories like sanitation reform or domestic architecture. They noticed that the room felt close and acted accordingly. If we follow that instinctive adjustment just a little further, we arrive at one of the most revealing contrasts of all. The difference between what a medieval house smelled like to its inhabitants, who knew its rhythms intimately, and what it smelled like to a newcomer crossing the threshold for the first time. That moment of first entry, with all its social tension and sensory judgment, opens another side of the story altogether. That moment of first entry, with all its social tension and sensory judgment, opens another side of the story altogether. A medieval house did not smell the same to everyone. The people who lived inside it had adapted, not in the sense of becoming numb to everything, but in the far subtler sense of knowing which smells belonged, which ones warned of trouble, and which ones were simply part of home. A visitor, by contrast, arrived without that map. He or she encountered the whole atmosphere at once. Smoke, damp wool, old rushes, cooked food, timber, breath, storage, waste from somewhere nearby, and perhaps a faint drift from animals or the street all came together in a single first impression. That impression could be socially powerful. We should not underestimate how much a house announced its household. Long before a guest had time to inspect the quality of linens, the condition of tools, or the arrangement of furniture, the nose had already begun to judge. Was the room freshened recently? Did the air feel close? Was the hearth smoky beyond what the weather excused? Was there a sourness in the bedding corner? Did the place smell of orderly cooking and warm wood, or of delay, dampness, and things not carried out in time? These were not trivial refinements. In a world where reputation depended on visible and invisible signs of competence, the smell of a home could help place a family socially almost at once. That is why hospitality and smell were so closely linked. To receive a guest decently was not only to offer food, drink, or shelter. It was also, where possible, to present the house in its best sensory condition. Fresh rushes might be laid if means allowed. The fire might be managed more carefully. A room could be aired in advance. Better cloths might be brought out. Herbs might be scattered or hung more conspicuously. Waste might be moved sooner. A bench near a sweeter current of air could be offered. None of this created modern cleanliness, but it mattered because hospitality was partly the art of controlling first impressions in a world where total control was impossible. There is a quiet sophistication in that. Medieval householders knew perfectly well that odor shaped perception. They did not need modern etiquette manuals to tell them that a close-smelling room embarrassed the host and discomforted the visitor. What varied was not awareness, but capacity. A prosperous household had more tools for staging a decent welcome. A poor one might have only labor, timing, and ingenuity. Yet even there, small sensory gestures could speak volumes. A room swept just before arrival. Pot carried out. A stool moved away from a damp wall. A bowl of clean water offered. A cloth that smelled of lavender or soap, if one could be managed. These were acts of respect. The interesting reversal is that visitors, precisely because they noticed the house as a whole, may have judged some homes more harshly than their inhabitants ever would. What a family experienced as a normal blend of smoke, wool, and recent cooking might strike an outsider as stifling. What the residents recognized as the faint but familiar scent of stored cheese or cured fish could, to a traveler already tired from the road, seem overpowering. Human beings are especially alert to new smells, and the medieval world was full of houses, halls, inns, workshops, and guest chambers whose atmospheres differed sharply from one another. To move from one household to another was to move through a sequence of smellscapes as distinctive as dialects. The inn is a particularly revealing case, not because every medieval traveler stayed in one, or because inns formed some neat separate category, but because they concentrated exactly the factors that made medieval domestic air so difficult. Many bodies, uncertain ventilation, repeated cooking, ale, damp clothing, transient bedding, animals nearby, boots tracked in from roads, and the endless turnover of guests all produced a kind of intensified household smell. An inn was not only a place of shelter. It was a place where strangers' lives overlapped in compressed sensory form. A room in such a place might be warmer, noisier, and more pungent than a private home because nothing had time to settle before another wave of use began. Travelers therefore lived by their noses to some extent. A decent hostelry might still smell of ale, horse, roast meat, smoke, and damp rushes, but the balance of those smells mattered. Too much sourness, too much stale bedding, too much latrine drift, and the place announced its standards. The same was true of guest chambers in ordinary homes. A chamber prepared for a visitor revealed the household's priorities not only in what was provided but in what had been cleared, aired, or sweetened. We often think of medieval hospitality in terms of status display, tapestries, silver, roast meats, servants. Yet, at a more ordinary level, hospitality also meant fighting the house's natural tendency to keep yesterday lingering in the air. This social aspect becomes sharper if we consider courtship, marriage negotiations, apprentices entering new homes, servants taking positions, or kin visiting one another. In all of these moments, people entered not just a building but a domestic environment that represented a family's habits. The smell of that environment could suggest prosperity, diligence, crowding, disorder, hard work, or strain. A prosperous merchant's house that smelled controlled, warm, and provisioned gave one kind of message. A poorer but well-managed cottage, where the air was still smoky yet clearly tended, gave another. A dwelling where damp, waste, and stale bedding pressed too visibly into the room could quietly damage reputation, even if the reasons were structural and not moral. This is one reason shame and pride attached so strongly to household management. The medieval home was one of the great theaters of competence. Much of that competence was practical and gendered. Women, servants, and other household workers often bore disproportionate responsibility for the invisible tasks that made a dwelling tolerable to others. If a guest noticed a foul room, the judgment did not remain abstract. It landed on particular bodies and roles. Someone had failed to air, sweep, empty, change, wash, or arrange in time, even when the deeper truth might be that there had simply not been enough hands, enough fuel, enough clear weather, enough healthy hours in the day. Smell therefore exposed not just dirt, but labor arrangements and the harsh arithmetic of domestic survival. And there was another layer too, less obvious but very important. Familiarity can soften judgment. The members of a household were accustomed to the sequence and meaning of their own smells. A guest was not. That meant the host could be surprised by what others noticed first. We all know some version of this even now. A house one knows well develops a sensory normality invisible to its inhabitants. But in the medieval context that effect was stronger, because the background level of material odor was higher and the tools for controlling it were fewer. A household might feel itself respectable because it had mastered the key signs of order within its means. A visitor from a wealthier or drier or less crowded household might register the same space very differently. This makes social comparison especially interesting. Medieval people did not live in a flat world where every house smelled equally bad. They experienced gradations constantly. The hall of a lord, the house of a guild master, the dwelling of a peasant, the chamber of a cleric, the lodging of a widow, the shophouse of a butcher, the cell of a monk, each had its own atmosphere. Movement between them sharpened awareness of difference. Wealth could be smelled. So could labor. So could crowding. One household might smell of roast meat, wax, and old smoke. Another of onions, damp wool, and stored grain. Another of leather and horse. Another of fish and salt. Another of sickness. These were not merely physical conditions. They were social worlds made sensible through the air. The church and monastery are worth pausing on here, because many modern listeners assume religious spaces offered complete relief from domestic odor. Sometimes they may indeed have felt cleaner, cooler, or more ordered than many lay houses, especially in larger stone buildings where incense, wax, and ritual care shaped the atmosphere. But monastic and clerical environments were still inhabited environments. They had kitchens, dormitories, infirmaries, latrines, laundries, gardens, storerooms, and bodies. A monastery might smell of beeswax, old wood, damp stone, vellum, broth, wet wool habits, smoke from kitchens, and the medicinal scents of herbs in the infirmary. That is a different smell from an urban artisan's house, but not the absence of smell. The sacred did not float free of the material. It organized it differently, and because incense and fragrant substances were used in religious settings, they offered medieval people another powerful contrast. To move from a lane or a crowded house into a church touched by candle wax and incense could feel like entering a differently ordered world. Yet even here the contrast depended on context. On feast days, a church full of bodies had its own density of breath, wool, damp cloaks, and muddy footwear. Burial spaces, relics, flowers, liturgical smoke, and stone all created layered atmospheres far richer than the clean blank neutrality many modern people subconsciously imagine. Still, the association of fragrant worship with sanctity undoubtedly sharpened awareness that some smells were elevating and others degrading. Domestic life sat uneasily between those poles. Another place where first impressions mattered deeply was the sick room. Anyone entering a room where someone had been ill for days would immediately understand that this was not ordinary domestic air. Fever changes rooms. So do repeated washings, stale linens, chamber pots not emptied quickly enough, medicinal preparations, sweat, vomit, and the heavier stillness that comes when windows are closed against weather or fear. Visitors to such rooms were often entering not simply to observe but to interpret, to decide how grave matters were, what could be done, whether the house had the means to manage the crisis. The smell of illness could terrify because it condensed so many worries at once. Suffering, possible contagion, labor overload, and the sense that the house itself had become burdened. It is no accident that later memory and writing often linger on the smell of sickness. Smell is difficult to formalize, yet unforgettable in personal recollection. A room where someone lay ill did not just look different. It smelled different in a way that could overwhelm conversation. In this sense, visitors sometimes became unwilling truth-tellers. They sensed immediately when a house had tipped from ordinary domestic strain into something more serious. The family within that house may have felt the change slowly, step by step, but the outsider encountered it all at once. Even celebration could produce its own sensory judgments. Feasts, weddings, christenings, and seasonal gatherings filled houses or halls with good food, drink, fresh activity, and perhaps sweet herbs or greenery laid down for the occasion. To later eyes, these moments may seem to offer relief from the harsher side of medieval domestic life, and in some ways they did. But they also intensified heat, crowding, spilled drink, food waste, and the sheer bodily reality of many people in one enclosed place. A festive room might smell splendid at the beginning and overpowering by the end. Success itself could have an after-smell. Trampled rushes, grease, stale ale, smoke, sweat, leftovers turning, and tired servants clearing too much too late. That dynamic is useful because it reminds us that smell was not only associated with poverty or failure. Even abundance had odors that lingered. Roast meats, sauces, wine or ale, fruit, herbs, wax candles, and crowded bodies produced a luxurious atmosphere that might be admired at first and oppressive after hours. Medieval life rarely offered the sensory simplicity modern curation prefers. Good and bad arrived together. A rich hall smelled better in some ways and more intensely in others. A poor house smelled harsher in some respects and simpler in others. Smell did not sort neatly into clean class categories. It moved with use, materials, weather, and density. Still, outsiders did judge, and that judgment could travel. Neighbors talked. Servants carried impressions from one household to another. Clerics, officials, merchants, and kin all moved through homes and took away stories. In a world where formal records capture only part of lived reputation, smell probably shaped informal opinion far more than we can directly document. One could be known as orderly, lax, prosperous, mean, hospitable, overcrowded, unhealthy, or falling on hard times partly through the atmospheres others encountered under one's roof. The medieval house, then, was not only lived in, it was interpreted. That interpretation extended even to marriage prospects and domestic suitability. A household that seemed too foul, too crowded, too damp, or too disorderly might raise questions about management, fertility, health, or solvency. A prospective in-law or future servant entering such a space would not necessarily speak only in terms of smell, but smell would color the impression. Conversely, a house that felt well-run, even if still smoky and materially simple, could inspire confidence. The difference here is subtle and important. Medieval people did not require a home to smell like a modern hotel lobby in order to think well of it. They required it to smell as though the inevitable burdens of life were being held in check. There is, perhaps, a gentle lesson in that. Modern viewers often imagine the past in absolutes: filthy or fragrant, ignorant or aware, primitive or refined. But the reality of entering a medieval house was probably far more relational. One judged a home against what was possible, against season, weather, rank, local custom, and the visible effort of its keepers. A smoky room on a wet winter day might be perfectly respectable. A sour room on a mild, dry day might provoke concern. Context mattered. People were not stupid noses attached to superstition. They were experienced interpreters of difficult environments. This also helps us understand why scenting practices could be so socially meaningful. Sweet herbs, flowers, fumigation, incense, and scented objects did more than mask odor. They signaled intention. They announced that someone cared how the room was received. A guest entering a chamber touched by rosemary, lavender, or fresh strewing would not imagine the house was naturally odorless. Rather, the pleasant note testified that labor had been directed toward welcome, purification, or status. It was the domestic equivalent of putting on better clothing for company. Not deception exactly, but presentation. And presentation, in a pre-modern context, often depended on the timing of labor rather than the permanent condition of a space. A house could be made ready for visitors for a few hours in ways that could not be sustained indefinitely. Waste could be moved out, floors newly strewn, bedding arranged, windows opened, food prepared, tableware cleaned, children scrubbed, and garments brushed. Then, as daily life resumed, the house would slowly return to its ordinary working smell. This is another reason the smell of a medieval home is so hard to reduce to one phrase. Was it the smell at dawn before chores, at midday during cooking, after rain on a feast day in winter during illness, when guests arrived or after they left? All were real, and none alone was the whole truth. If we imagine a stranger entering just after a storm, for example, the first impression might be of wet wool, smoke, churned mud, steaming shoes, and a room trying bravely to dry itself. Another stranger visiting at harvest might notice grain dust, stored vegetables, sweat from labor, and the dry sharpness of fresh-cut material brought indoors. A visitor in late winter might meet stale air, old smoke, dwindling stores, and bedding not often aired enough. One in summer might encounter flies, sharper waste smells from outdoors, lighter clothing, open doors, and food spoiling faster than the house could comfortably manage. Each would go away with a different story about what a medieval house smelled like. That seasonal variability may be one reason modern reconstructions often feel too clean or too fixed. Museum spaces, restored cottages, and historical sets can show furniture and building materials beautifully, but they struggle to recreate the moving atmosphere of a lived house under changing conditions. They smell faintly of timber, perhaps of controlled smoke, maybe a little straw. What they usually lack is the active mixture of recent occupation. Damp while drying badly, stale ale in a mug, onion peel in the corner, chamber use from the night, and the outside world pressing in. Without that movement, the structure appears calmer than it would have been in life. And yet, for the people who belonged to such houses, belonging itself softened the strangeness. Home is rarely judged by smell alone from within. It is judged by whether the fire catches, whether the roof holds, whether the stores last, whether children sleep, whether the bed is dry enough, whether the cow or pig or hens are safe, whether neighbors are tolerable, whether the rain stays out, whether the room is respectable enough when someone knocks at the door. A medieval person might find another house oppressive while remaining deeply attached to one that would strike a modern visitor as equally difficult. Home carried memory, routine, kinship, and labor. Smell was bound up with all of them. That may be why the threshold between insider and outsider matters so much. To step into a medieval house as a stranger was to confront its material truth quickly. To live in it was to understand that truth as negotiable, familiar, and full of meaning. The same smoky bedchamber might seem close and unpleasant to a guest, yet reassuring to the person who had survived winter after winter in it. The same storage corner might smell pungent to an outsider and comforting to the housewife who knew it meant the family still had food. Even the smell of animals drifting in from nearby could mean hardship to one person and security to another. Sensory life is never only physical. It is interpreted through need and memory. If we take that seriously, then one of the most revealing questions is not simply how bad the house smelled, but what medieval people themselves would have considered worth fighting, worth tolerating, and worth cherishing despite the discomfort. Some smells warned of disorder. Some meant work. Some meant abundance. Some meant danger. Some meant warmth. And some, however unpleasant to us, meant that ordinary life was proceeding as it should. That hierarchy of meanings shaped every practical decision inside the home. A family might endure smoke longer than we can easily imagine because heat mattered more. They might tolerate strong curing smells because preserved food mattered more. They might accept animal nearness because security and warmth mattered more. They might prioritize clean linen over frequently washed outer clothes because linen worked hardest at the skin. They might focus on moving human waste quickly even if damp remained in the walls, because some threats felt more urgent than others. In other words, domestic smell was organized by priorities, and priorities were shaped by survival. Once we begin to see that hierarchy, the medieval house grows more intelligible and, in a quiet way, more intimate. The smells were not random. They reflected choices made under pressure, compromises between comfort and necessity, between what could be controlled and what had to be endured. And if we want to understand those compromises most clearly, there is perhaps no better place to look next than the people who spent the most time managing them, especially the women and servants whose labor quietly determined whether a house felt tolerable, shameful, respectable, or barely survivable from one day to the next. Especially the women and servants whose labor quietly determined whether a house felt tolerable, shameful, respectable, or barely survivable from one day to the next. If medieval houses smelled worse than most people imagine, then part of the reason is that modern people often picture the smell without picturing the work. They imagine the room, the rushes, the hearth, the damp walls, perhaps the animals, but not the hands constantly moving through that environment trying to prevent it from tipping further into discomfort. The medieval house was held together by repeated acts of domestic management, and much of that work was done by people whose effort rarely survives in grand historical memory. For many households, this labor belonged first to women, though age, class, marital status, region, and household structure changed its exact shape. A wife, widow, daughter, female servant, laundress, maid, or older child might each take part in different portions of the same sensory battle. Fire had to be watched. Water had to be fetched and used carefully. Bedding had to be arranged, aired, beaten, and mended. Cloths had to be washed when possible. Food had to be prepared, stored, stretched, and rescued before spoilage went too far. Chamber vessels had to be dealt with. Floors had to be swept, old strewing removed, and new material brought in when means allowed. Small domestic crises, a pot turning, a child soiling its linen, rain entering where it should not, a neighbor's pig breaking order in the yard, were not abstract inconveniences. They became somebody's task immediately. This is one of the most important trust-building points in the whole story, because it helps explain not only what a medieval house smelled like, but why it smelled the way it did. Domestic odor was partly a measure of invisible labor. A room that seemed merely smoky and warm might actually represent hours of careful maintenance. A room that smelled sour or neglected might reflect exhaustion, illness, widowhood, overcrowding, poverty, or a season of relentless bad weather rather than simple carelessness. In other words, smell did not only reveal the house, it revealed the pressure placed on the people maintaining it. The housewife, especially in moral and practical literature, was often imagined as the guardian of order. That does not mean every real woman lived up to an ideal laid down in text, but it does tell us something about expectation. Good household government was associated with clean linen where possible, orderly stores, proper handling of food, managed servants, contained waste, and a dwelling that reflected competence. What interests us here is how strongly these ideals were tied to the senses. A disorderly home was not just messy to the eye. It was close, stale, smoky beyond excuse, foul in its corners, careless in its waste, inattentive in its bedding, sluggish in its kitchen. The ideal mistress of the house was, in effect, expected to manage atmosphere. An atmosphere is a demanding thing to manage when one has no modern plumbing, no automatic ventilation, no washing machine, no sealed flooring, and often very little spare time. One of the quieter injustices of domestic history is that it asks people to be judged against conditions they did not create and could only partially control. If the room smelled of wet wool because rain had lasted a week, someone still had to live inside the judgment of that smell. If the rushes had gone stale because there was no chance to fetch fresh ones, the room still accused its keepers. If a child's sickness changed the whole chamber, a woman might work constantly to ease that burden and still fail to make the space acceptable to a visitor. The labor was real even when the result remained imperfect. Servants altered this picture but did not erase its hardness. In middling and wealthier households, maids, kitchen workers, laundresses, chamber servants, and other domestic staff took on a great share of the work that made a house smell more controlled than it otherwise would have. They emptied vessels, cleaned floors, tended fires, moved bedding, carried refuse, washed cloths, and aired rooms. This is one reason elite households could smell better, or at least more managed, than poorer ones. It was not merely a matter of architecture or luxury goods. It was also a matter of labor concentration. More people were available to push odor outward, upward, or away from the most socially important rooms. But this too has its irony. A noble chamber may have smelled sweeter partly because unpleasant work had been displaced into kitchens, service corridors, yards, laundry spaces, and servants' bodies. The scent of privilege often depended on someone else handling smoke, wet ashes, greasy pots, chamber waste, and sour linen. Domestic comfort was not only bought through materials, it was produced through hierarchy. That is worth holding in mind, because it prevents us from imagining refined medieval interiors as somehow naturally cleaner. They were cleaner in the way many privileged spaces always are, by moving dirt, smell, and labor somewhere else. Laundry shows this particularly well. To modern viewers, washing is a task among many. In the medieval house, it was a massive periodic effort with consequences for nearly everything that touched the body. Linen shifts, shirts, sheets, towels, swaddling cloths, napkins, and bandages all served as barriers between skin and outer garments, between bodily oils and expensive fabrics, between sweat and social embarrassment. Washing them was therefore one of the main ways a household fought smell at its source. Yet the washing itself required hauling water, heating it, mixing soap or lye, soaking, beating, wringing, rinsing, drying, and storing. If weather turned, the whole process could falter. If fuel ran low, washing became harder. If labor ran short, linens waited too long. A household with abundant clean linen could smell noticeably different from one without it, even if both still lived in smoky rooms and wore wool outer garments. This is an important correction to the old caricature that everyone in the Middle Ages simply wore filthy clothes until they rotted away. Many people understood very well that linen next to the skin mattered. It absorbed, could be washed more often than wool. It offered a degree of bodily freshness even when full bathing was infrequent. But again, awareness did not equal ease. The household needed time, strength, water, and weather to make this system work. Think for a moment about the smell of laundry not as the result but as the process. Heated water, ash, soap, damp cloth, old sweat being lifted out, steam rising in a working yard or room, and then the uncertain wait for drying. A modern person tends to associate laundry with cleanliness because the cycle disappears into appliances. In the medieval world, laundry was itself a pungent, tiring event. For a few hours or days, the household might feel even more disordered in the effort to become more respectable. Cloth hung where it could. Water was carried in and out. Floors were splashed. The smell of lye or boiled cloth entered the domestic air. Improvement came through turbulence. Cooking was no different. The person controlling the hearth controlled much of the house's atmosphere. To keep a fire alive without choking the room, to cook food without letting grease and spoilage overtake the work area, to manage scraps before they went sour, to dry herbs or warm water or soften hard bread without overcrowding the fire zone. All of this required skill. It is easy to romanticize open hearth cooking from a distance, but the woman or servant standing there was working inside smoke, heat, smell, and urgency. The kitchen, whether a distinct room or part of a broader living space, was a place of continual sensory decision-making. What should be boiled now? What must be used before it turns? What can be hung to dry? What must be carried out immediately? What can wait until light improves or rain stops? The housekeeper's nose was therefore part of her toolkit. She needed it to detect spoilage early, to judge whether damp was worsening in bedding or cloth, to notice whether the smoke was lingering unusually low, to tell when a child's condition had changed, to sense whether the privy arrangement was becoming intrusive, to distinguish ordinary strong odors from dangerous ones. This is where historical empathy matters. Medieval domestic management was intelligent work, even when it was unrecorded and repetitive. It required a constant reading of materials in a world where the margin for error could be narrow. Smell was evidence, warning, and workload all together. Children, too, learned this sensory order early. A girl helping her mother or mistress with cloth, floors, vessels, food, or younger siblings would gradually absorb the domestic map of the house. She would learn which corner stayed damp longest, which pot needed more scouring, which bedding had to be turned first, which season made the privy worst, which herbs were worth strewing, which garments could be aired and which needed proper washing, which weather helped the house and which one turned it against itself. Even boys, depending on household type and labor demands, learned parts of this system through chores tied to fuel, animals, hauling, and yard work. Domestic smell was therefore not merely endured. It was taught, interpreted, and responded to as part of growing into the household. This brings us to a subtler point about gender and respectability. The smell of a house could affect how a woman was judged in her community because domestic order was so often seen as her sphere, even when she lacked the resources to secure that order fully. A respectable house did not have to be luxurious, but it did have to show effort. Freshened linen when possible, food not obviously spoiling, waste not left too near the door, children not appearing wholly neglected, floors not intolerably foul. These formed a language of competence. The cruelty, of course, is that poverty could undermine each of these while leaving the woman herself open to blame. Smell made hardship visible in the air. Widows were especially vulnerable to this pressure. Without a husband's labor or income, or with children depending on them, they often had to sustain household order under more difficult conditions. A house growing sour or poorly maintained might reflect grief, overwork, or economic strain, but neighbors could still interpret it morally. The same is true of illness. If the person chiefly responsible for domestic management became sick, the house might deteriorate quickly. Bedding remained unturned. Water was not fetched in the usual quantity. Scraps stayed too long. Laundry backed up. The room smelled different not because values had changed, but because the laboring body that usually held back disorder had been removed. That fragility tells us something essential. Medieval domestic comfort was incredibly dependent on continual human effort. It did not persist automatically. A well-run house could slide toward unpleasantness in a matter of days if key tasks went undone. This is why servants mattered so much in larger households and why kin networks mattered in smaller ones. Help was not merely convenient. It was what kept domestic order from collapsing when birth, sickness, harvest, travel, or death interrupted the ordinary routine. We can see this most clearly during childbirth. Birth took place in the home for most people, and it transformed the atmosphere of the house before, during, and after the event. The chamber had to be prepared as well as circumstances allowed. Cloths, water, heat, attendance, and privacy had to be arranged. The room then filled with sweat, blood, breath, fear, effort, and later the smells of postpartum care, soiled linens, and a newborn body. Nothing about this was clean in the modern clinical sense, yet it could be deeply ordered by the knowledge of women assisting the process. The domestic sphere was at its most intense here, both physically and emotionally. Again, we see that the house was not merely a background. It was the site where life's heaviest realities unfolded. And because those realities unfolded there, women's labor often included the work of restoring the house afterward. The same applies to sickness. Wash the cloths, air the bedding, carry out waste, boil water, sweep, reorder the room, replace what can be replaced, comfort the living, prepare the dead if necessary. The emotional and sensory burdens were not separate. They were borne together, often by the same people. A medieval home, then, smelled as it did partly because the duties of care were concentrated inside it. Modern institutions distribute those burdens outward. The medieval household kept them close. Servants in elite households sometimes experienced the domestic world differently because they moved between sweeter and fouler zones. A chambermaid might pass from perfumed fabric and fresh rushes in a noble room to sour linen in a washing area, then to kitchen smoke, then to a service stair near privies or storage spaces. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the apparent refinement of great houses rested on relentless backstage labor. The noble guest smelled rosemary and beeswax. The servants smelled that too, but also ash, chamber waste, grease, damp cloth, and the hidden corners where grandeur depended on being cleaned up after. That layered experience gives us a richer picture of class. It was not only that the rich and poor lived in different smells. It was that some people moved among many smell worlds while others remained trapped in one or two. A servant or craft worker attached to a large household might know the contrast between the hall, the buttery, the kitchen, the stable passage, the laundry, and the sleeping quarters of staff intimately. Such a person understood very well that comfort was distributed unevenly. The grand chamber was not the whole house. It was the polished face of a larger domestic machine. There is also an emotional intelligence in domestic labor that is easy to miss if we focus only on surfaces. The person keeping house needed to know not just what smelled bad, but what kind of bad it was, and what emotional response it would provoke. A guest might tolerate hearth smoke on a cold day, but not a sour bed. A husband might ignore much of the room and still notice spoiled food. A child frightened by illness might be soothed if the chamber were aired and the linens changed. A neighbor might judge a family harshly if the yard smelled wrong near the lane. To keep house was therefore partly to anticipate how others would sense it. And yet, for all that pressure, there were moments of domestic victory. Fresh linen drying well in good weather. A room newly swept and aired after rain. Herbs spread with purpose. Winter bedding beaten and improved on the first bright day. Pot saved in time from spoiling. A guest received into a room that smelled better than usual. These were small triumphs, but meaningful ones. They gave shape to dignity. They reminded householders that life could be improved even within severe constraints. The medieval home did not often become spotless, but it could become more bearable, more ordered, more itself at its best. This is one reason we should be careful not to narrate the past only through disgust. The smells were real and often harsh, but the labor against them was real too. To focus only on the offensive atmosphere is to miss the quiet competence of people who kept children alive, food edible, cloth usable, and rooms tolerable without the systems we rely on every day. Their world smelled stronger because they lived closer to the material basis of life, but they also developed forms of care precisely suited to that closeness. If anything, the deeper irony is that the people most responsible for improving the smell of the house were often the people least visible in formal history. Men appear more readily in records of war, trade, law, and politics. Women and servants appear more often when they fail, transgress, marry, inherit, or die. But the smell of a medieval house, perhaps more than most topics, pushes us toward the hidden majority of daily labor. Someone had to make the room less foul than it wanted to be. Someone had to notice the first sour sign in the chest, the first dampness in the bedding, the first hint that the privy was drifting too near the main room. Someone had to act, and action often meant compromise rather than cure. Air the room, but do not lose too much heat. Wash the linen, but spare enough fuel for cooking. Move the animal farther off, but not so far that it risks theft or cold. Open the shutter, but not during driving rain. Replace the rushes, but only when fresh ones can be cut. Empty the vessel now, even though darkness and mud make it unpleasant. Use the herbs in this room rather than that one, because a guest may arrive or the child is unwell. Domestic management was not a program of purity. It was a sequence of decisions under pressure, and those decisions shaped the smell of the home moment by moment. That pressure also reveals why certain rooms or households might abruptly smell worse than they had a season earlier. A servant left. A mother gave birth. A daughter married out. A husband fell ill. A harvest failed. A widow aged. Suddenly the same house, same walls, same hearth, same chest, same floor, could no longer be held in the same way. Smell therefore tracked the life cycle of the household. It changed with family composition, labor capacity, fortune, and health. A home was not just built, it was maintained into being. And once that becomes clear, another question naturally follows. If the labor of women and servants shaped the air inside the house so profoundly, what did medieval people themselves try to use, practically and deliberately, to improve that air? Not merely to clean after the fact, but to scent, purify, sweeten, and manage the house in intentional ways. That next layer takes us from labor into remedy, and from endurance into the little domestic technologies by which people tried to make medieval homes smell less like necessity and a little more like comfort. And those small domestic technologies, those herbs, smokes, linens, routines, and quiet adjustments, bring us gently to the edge of what this story has been about all along. Because when we ask why medieval houses smelled worse than we imagine, the deeper answer is not simply that they were dirty, or primitive, or indifferent to comfort. It is that they were honest spaces. They held everything. They held warmth and smoke, food and preservation, illness and care, animals and people, labor and rest, birth and death, all within walls that could not hide very much. What we now separate into different rooms, systems, and buildings, medieval life gathered together. And when life gathers, it leaves a trace, often a strong one. Modern homes are designed to remove those traces as quickly and quietly as possible. Waste disappears into pipes. Moisture is controlled by materials and machines. Air is circulated, filtered, replaced. Laundry vanishes into cycles. Food is sealed. Animals are separated. Illness is often moved elsewhere. The house is protected from life's rough edges in ways that feel natural to us now, but are actually very recent. The medieval house did not have that protection. So instead of hiding life, it revealed it. It revealed how hard people worked to keep things in balance. It revealed when that balance slipped. It revealed the presence of bodies, of weather, of food in transition, of materials wearing down, of systems under strain. It revealed care, and it revealed exhaustion. It revealed prosperity in small comforts, and hardship in lingering sourness. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed that cleanliness, as we understand it today, is not just a matter of personal discipline. It is a matter of infrastructure, time, labor, and resources layered together over centuries. If you step back from the details, from the rushes, the hearth, the bedding, the storage, the privy, the yard, and the street, what remains is something quietly human. A house that smelled not because people didn't care, but because they were living very close to everything that kept them alive. And if there's one thought to leave you with tonight, it's this. When you imagine a medieval home, try not to picture it as simply worse than yours. Picture it as fuller. Full of work, full of bodies, full of weather, full of necessity, and yes, full of smells that told the people inside it exactly how well their world was holding together that day. And I'm curious, what part of that world felt the hardest to imagine living in? If you'd like more calm, deeply grounded history like this, you're always welcome here whenever you need it.